There's a town in America that doesn't exist on any map. It has a harbor and a desert and a mountain range and an ocean all within driving distance of each other. Its residents have yellow skin. Its fish have 3 eyes. Its richest citizen hasn't visibly aged in over a century. And somewhere at the center of it all, cooling towers rise against the sky, cracked and leaking, maintained by a man with an IQ so low, the show itself describes it as a clinical disability. We're going to spend 4 hours in that town tonight. Get comfortable. Find your position. Let the lights stay low, because Springfield has a lot to say if you're willing to listen, and most of what it's been saying for 36 years has been hiding in plain sight. We're starting with the theory that makes everything else make sense, the one that sits at the center of Springfield like a reactor core, quietly irradiating every storyline, every character, every impossible thing that happens in this town and gets forgotten by the following week's episode. The Springfield nuclear power plant is poisoning everyone, not as a metaphor, not as background texture for jokes. Literally, physically, and systematically, the plant has been contaminating its surrounding population for the entirety of the show's run. And the evidence the show provides for this is so thorough, so consistent, and so deliberately layered that after you see it once, you cannot stop seeing it. Let's begin with what the show establishes as baseline fact. The Springfield nuclear power plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, the wealthiest man in Springfield and arguably the most powerful individual in the state, whichever state that happens to be depending on the episode. The plant provides electricity for the entire town. It is the economic foundation of Springfield. Without it, the town's primary employer disappears, its power goes dark, and the entire community structure collapses. Burns knows this. The residents know it too, even if they've never articulated the thought. The plant isn't just part of Springfield's landscape, it's the reason Springfield functions at all. And it is, by any reasonable standard, one of the most dangerous industrial facilities ever depicted in fiction. A surprise safety inspection of the plant found 342 separate violations. 342. The estimated cost to bring the facility up to regulatory compliance was $56 million. Burns refused to spend it. The show makes his reasoning clear in the way it always makes Burns' reasoning clear, which is through action rather than monologue. He doesn't spend the money because spending it would mean acknowledging the violations. Acknowledging the violations would invite questions. Questions would lead to investigations. And investigations might eventually surface answers that Burns has spent decades making sure nobody asks for. The violations themselves are worth sitting with for a moment, because the show doesn't present them as dramatic horror. It presents them as casual background detail, which is exactly how the most effective storytelling works. You're not supposed to be alarmed. You're supposed to accept this as normal Springfield business. Radioactive waste is being dumped directly into the town's water sources. Radioactive waste is being deposited on children's playgrounds. Plutonium, weapons-grade nuclear material, is being used as a decorative paperweight on someone's desk inside the facility. The cooling towers that are supposed to prevent catastrophic meltdown have cracks in them that have been patched with chewing gum. Luminous rats that glow in the dark because of their radiation exposure, move freely through the lower levels of the plant. And then there are the human skeletons in the basement. The show mentions this and moves on. Human skeletons discovered in the basement of an operational nuclear power plant. Nobody investigates. Nobody from the outside world shows up with questions. The bones are simply there. And Springfield processes this information the same way it processes every other alarming piece of information, which is to decide collectively that it isn't worth thinking about. Now consider who is responsible for preventing all of this from getting worse. Homer Simpson holds the title of safety inspector at the Springfield nuclear power plant. His job, the literal function he is paid to perform, is to ensure that the facility does not cause harm to the surrounding community. The show's own creator, Matt Groening, has stated in interviews that Homer has an IQ of 55. 55. To provide some context, that number places him in a range that clinical psychology describes as moderate intellectual disability. He is not simply an average man who makes poor choices. He is operating with a cognitive profile that makes complex risk assessment, long-term consequence thinking, and sustained attention essentially impossible for him. And this is before we get to the crayon. Season 12 of the show reveals that Homer has had a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood. A crayon. inserted through his nostril during an accident when he was very young, and then left there, physically pressing against the tissue of his frontal lobe, reducing his cognitive function in ways that no doctor in Springfield ever detected or attempted to address. When the crayon is removed in that season 12 episode, Homer's IQ rises dramatically. He becomes articulate. He processes complex information with speed and clarity. He sees the world around him with a sharpness he has never experienced before. And it makes him miserable. He sees Springfield clearly for the first time, and what he sees is so bleak and so lonely that he chooses to have the crayon reinserted. He chooses diminished cognition over the clarity of understanding his own situation. But we'll come back to that. The important thing right now is this. The man responsible for nuclear safety in a town of thousands has been operating with a foreign object physically reducing his brain function, and he sleeps at his workstation, eats donuts during meltdown warnings, and once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a confection into the reactor core to see what would happen to it. That is the wall between Springfield and catastrophe. Now here is where the evidence begins to accumulate into something that feels less like cartoon background detail and more like deliberate storytelling. The very first mutation the show presents appears in Season 2. A fish is pulled from a river near the power plant. This fish has 3 eyes. The show treats this as a significant enough discovery that it becomes a political issue. A candidate for governor uses the fish, named Blinky, as evidence that Burns is contaminating the local environment. The political pressure becomes intense enough that Burns is forced to appear on live television and eat the fish to demonstrate that it is safe. The town watches. The show moves on. Blinky disappears from the narrative. But Blinky never disappears from the argument, because Blinky is the show's first explicit acknowledgement of what the plant is doing to living organisms in Springfield. A fish with a genetic mutation so visible and so dramatic that it became a news story and a campaign platform. And the immediate follow-up question, the one that should have been asked the moment that fish appeared, is this. If the radiation is doing that to the fish, what is it doing to the people who drink the water those fish swim in? The show answers this question in Season 8, in an episode called The Springfield Files. Homer sees something in the woods near Springfield. He describes it as an alien. The town panics. 2 FBI investigators are called in, their names borrowed from a popular television series about paranormal investigations. The episode builds toward a reveal, and the reveal is this. The creature in the woods is not an alien. It's Mr. Burns stumbling home through the forest after one of his weekly medical treatments, his body emitting a visible green glow from the intensity of what has been administered to him. Burns undergoes a radiation-intensive treatment regimen every 7 days. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days. Without it, he would die. The regimen is so extreme that it causes his body to literally glow in the dark for hours afterward, and in this weakened, saturated state, he wanders through the woods outside the facility in a daze that makes him look, to the untrained eye, like something that does not belong to this world. Springfield's residents see a glowing figure in the forest, and their first instinct is extraterrestrial visitation. The nuclear power plant that dominates their skyline, the one with 342 safety violations, does not occur to them as an explanation. Radiation does not occur to them. The plant that employs many of them and provides electricity to all of them is simply not on the list of possible explanations for a glowing figure near its grounds. That is not stupidity. That is the specific cognitive result of decades of low-level contamination affecting the frontal lobe's capacity for causal reasoning. The part of the brain that connects observable phenomena to their likely causes has been so consistently suppressed by environmental contamination that the residents of Springfield have simply lost the ability to make that particular connection. And the Simpsons movie takes this evidence to its logical conclusion. In the film, Springfield's environmental contamination reaches a threshold so severe that the Environmental Protection Agency, presented as an active federal agency within the show's universe, concludes that the town poses a biological hazard to the surrounding region. Their solution is to seal Springfield under an enormous glass dome, physically containing the town and its pollution to prevent it from spreading outward. Every resident is inside when the dome goes up. The United States government looks at Springfield and decides the entire town qualifies as a containment zone. This is the show, in its most broadly seen piece of content, explicitly confirming that Springfield is an environmental disaster area. And the characters inside the dome continue behaving more or less normally, because for them, the dome is merely the most recent dramatic event in a long series of dramatic events that the town will forget by the next episode. Now look at the physical characteristics of Springfield's residents through the lens of what we know about radiation exposure. Homer Simpson has a skull shape that defies standard human anatomy. His jaw is massive and prognathic. His eyes bulge outward in a way that suggests elevated intracranial pressure. He has 4 fingers on each hand, which is a specific numerical deviation from the standard human digit count that appears uniformly across the Springfield population. His IQ, even without the crayon, falls well below the population average. His pain tolerance is extraordinary, well beyond what a normally functioning nervous system would produce. He has survived being shot, electrocuted, falling from significant heights, being struck by vehicles, and being caught in explosions, and he walks away from each of these events with implausible speed and completeness of recovery. His healing rate is not human. It is something that a body operating under a fundamentally altered biological framework might produce. Marge Simpson presents similarly. The same bulging eyes, the same 4-finger count, hair that grows vertically and maintains its exact shape across 36 years without apparent maintenance, which suggests a tensile property in the hair itself that does not exist in normal human hair. Marge was briefly employed at the nuclear power plant herself. She was exposed directly to the same environment, the same violations, the same leaking systems that Homer was exposed to across the entirety of his working life. And their children, all 3 of them, were conceived after both parents had been living in Springfield's contaminated environment for years. Bart's hair maintains multiple distinct spikes without any product, styling, or support structure. Lisa's hair forms 2 distinct peaks that remain geometrically perfect regardless of weather, activity, or the passage of time. Maggie's physical development, while superficially normal for an infant, is, as we will discuss in considerable detail later, anything but normal on closer examination. The most striking piece of evidence, the one that makes the entire radiation theory click into something coherent, is the comparison between Springfield residents and visitors. When celebrities appear in Springfield, when characters from outside the town arrive as guests, they look different. Not slightly different in terms of artistic style, fundamentally different in proportion, in the shape of their eyes, in the geometry of their features. Outsiders have eyes that are more naturally positioned. Their proportions more closely approximate what a human being actually looks like. Their features are drawn with a specificity and a naturalism that the regular Springfield cast is never given. The standard explanation for this is artistic. That's just how The Simpsons looks. The show has a house style, and that style is what you're seeing when you look at Homer or Marge. It's animation. It doesn't mean anything. But that explanation dissolves the moment you notice that the show is capable of drawing characters with more realistic proportions. The visitor characters prove that. The show's artists can produce more natural-looking human beings. They simply choose not to when they're drawing Springfield residents. Within the logic of the show's own universe, there is an observable and consistent visual difference between people who live inside the contaminated zone and people who come from outside it. The people inside the dome look mutated. The people outside it look like people. Even the animals are not exempt. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same protruding eyes as his owners. His proportions deviate from real canine anatomy in the same ways that the human characters deviate from real human anatomy. The family's cat shows similar characteristics. Springfield's wildlife, as explicitly demonstrated by Blinky, has been demonstrably altered by the plant's discharge. The show tells you directly that the 3-eyed fish is what radiation does to living organisms in this environment. And then it expects you to believe that the humans drinking the same water have been entirely untouched. Burns understands all of this. The show is careful to make this clear across multiple storylines and multiple seasons. Burns has private physicians. He funds medical research. He undergoes the weekly treatment regimen that keeps him alive by managing his own radiation saturation. Burns understands radiation better than anyone else in Springfield because his own survival is dependent on understanding it. He manages the effects in his own body with precision and resources that no one else in town has access to. And he knows what his plant is doing to the town because he has been watching it happen for decades. His continued employment of Homer is not negligence. It is not an oversight. When German investors briefly purchased the plant, the very first thing they did after taking ownership was terminate Homer's employment. The second thing they did was assess what it would cost to bring the facility up to code. The estimate nearly bankrupted them. They sold the plant back to Burns, and Burns immediately rehired Homer. A competent safety inspector would shut the plant down within weeks of starting the job. Homer's incompetence is not a liability for Burns. It is an asset. Homer ensures that the violations remain violations. The radiation keeps leaking. The water stays poisoned. Burns maintains his monopoly over Springfield's power supply, and by extension, over its economy, and by extension, over its people. A population too cognitively impaired by decades of contamination to recognize what is being done to them. The Crayon episode, Season 12, offers the most chilling confirmation of this reading. When the crayon is removed and Homer's intelligence returns, he doesn't feel liberated. He feels like he's seeing the bars of a cage for the first time. He sees his job with clarity. He sees his town with clarity. He sees the power plant, and he sees what it is. And the weight of that understanding is more than he can carry. He chooses the fog. He chooses to go back. But the episode never asks the question it should ask. How did a crayon end up inside a child's brain without any medical professional in Springfield noticing it? Homer visited doctors throughout his childhood. He received checkups. He was examined by medical personnel in a town that has at least 2 hospitals. And across all of those examinations, across all of those years, not one physician detected a foreign object in his skull. Either the medical establishment in Springfield is so catastrophically incompetent that it constitutes a systemic failure that goes well beyond any individual doctor's failings, or the medical establishment in Springfield is not actually independent. If Burns's influence extends into the town's healthcare infrastructure, if the doctors are part of the same network of controlled institutions that Burns has been building for over a century, then the possibility exists that the crayon was known and was left where it was, because a cognitively diminished Homer was exactly the kind of employee Burns needed in Sector 7G. The radiation theory does not explain one mystery about The Simpsons. It explains all of them. The characters do not age because their mutated cellular biology has been fundamentally altered by long-term radiation exposure, affecting the mechanisms by which normal biological aging progresses. The town resets between catastrophic events because the population's capacity for forming and retaining long-term memories has been compromised by chronic neurological damage from contamination. Homer survives injuries that should be fatal because his body has adapted to environmental radiation in ways that make his tissue abnormally resilient, while simultaneously devastating his cognitive function. Burns stays alive through artificial intervention because he is the only person in Springfield with enough resources and knowledge to manage his own radiation exposure, while everyone around him simply absorbs it. And nobody in Springfield asks any of these questions because the same contamination that mutated their bodies has damaged the specific neural architecture responsible for critical thinking, for causal reasoning, for the ability to look at a 3-eyed fish and then look at the cracked cooling towers and then look at their own 4-fingered hands and connect those 3 observations into a single coherent thought. Springfield is not a quirky animated town where unusual things happen for comedic effect. Springfield is a contamination zone. Its residents are not eccentric. They are symptomatic. Every yellow face, every bulging eye, every impossible recovery from what should be a fatal injury, every catastrophe that is forgotten by the following week, every question that goes unasked, every connection that goes unmade, every time the town resets to normal as if nothing happened. It all leads back to the same cracked cooling tower, leaking the same invisible contamination into the same water supply that flows through the same damaged brains that cannot understand why their fish have 3 eyes and their children have 4 fingers and their employer glows in the dark after his Thursday evening medical appointments. The power plant is not part of the show. It is the engine of the show. Everything that happens in Springfield happens because of what that plant has done and continues to do to the people living in its shadow. And the plant will never be fixed. Because fixing it would mean admitting that it was broken, and admitting that it was broken would mean starting to answer for what it has already done. And Burns has spent over a century making sure that particular conversation never begins. Before we move on, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe. Now let's go deeper. Everything we just discussed about the radiation theory assumes something. It assumes that Springfield is a real place. that the events the show depicts actually happened within the logic of its universe, and that the characters we are watching are awake. What if that assumption is wrong? What if the most complete and internally consistent explanation for everything we have seen across 36 seasons of this show is not that Springfield's residents have been mutated by radiation, but that there is only one resident whose experience we are actually seeing, and that resident has not been conscious since the spring of 1993? This is the Homer coma theory. It is the most widely discussed, most elaborately supported, and most emotionally devastating fan theory in the history of The Simpsons. And the reason it refuses to go away, the reason it keeps returning to the conversation despite official denials from the people who make the show, is that it does something no other explanation has managed to do. It makes everything make sense. Let's begin with the event itself. On April 1st, 1993, the 18th episode of the show's 4th season aired. The episode was called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The basic premise was built around Bart playing escalating April Fool's pranks on Homer, each one more destructive than the last, until Bart takes one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and places it inside an industrial paint shaker. When Homer opens the can, the resulting explosion is violent enough to send him to the hospital. This is where most people's memory of the episode ends. Homer goes to the hospital. Bart feels guilty. Homer wakes up and strangles his son. The family laughs. The end. But the episode doesn't end there. Not really. While Homer is lying in his hospital bed in the aftermath of the explosion, he sees a vending machine across the room. He tries to get a candy bar from it. The machine tips over. It lands on Homer, and Homer Simpson flatlines. He enters a coma. A real, medically documented clinical coma that the show depicts without ambiguity and without the usual cartoon cushioning of a cutaway or a dream sequence label. The episode ends with Homer apparently waking up. Bart is at his bedside, confessing tearfully that the prank was his fault, and Homer springs awake and immediately begins strangling his son. The family is relieved. Everyone laughs. The show tells you he woke up, and you believe it, because why wouldn't you? Except the episode also tells you, in its final moments, that Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5%, gone permanently, never coming back. And Homer's response to learning that he is now measurably more brain damaged than he was before is to laugh and to note, with a kind of baffled cheerfulness, that he doesn't know why he's laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody expresses concern. The episode ends, the show continues for 32 more seasons, and that 5% is never mentioned again. Unless Homer never actually woke up, the theory, which was originally articulated by a Reddit user known as Hard to Pick a Name, proposes something simple and quietly shattering. Homer did not regain consciousness at the end of that April 1993 episode. The apparent waking up, the strangling of Bart, the family's laughter, it was the first moment of the dream. Every single episode that has aired since that date exists inside the mind of a man who is lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, surrounded by his family, losing brain function in increments too slow to see from any individual moment, but visible across the arc of decades. The evidence for this is not one thing. It is an accumulation of observations that, taken together, form a picture that is surprisingly difficult to argue with. Consider the tonal shift. In the show's first 4 seasons, before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a grounded piece of domestic satire. It was not realistic in the way that live-action drama is realistic, but its storylines were rooted in recognizable human experience. Homer struggles with addiction to alcohol. Marge wrestles with the possibility of romantic feelings for another man. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher and faces the particular loneliness of being a child who is too intelligent for her surroundings. Bart fails academically and faces the possibility of being held back a year. These are the problems of real families. They are filtered through the lens of satire and animation, but their emotional core is grounded in the kind of anxieties that actual human beings carry. Financial stress, marital tension, the fear of not being enough, the longing to be seen. After the coma episode, every one of those anchors is cut loose. Homer goes to space. Homer meets God. Homer joins a secret fraternal organization. Homer discovers that his mother, who he believed was dead, is alive and has been living underground as a fugitive radical for the entirety of his adult life. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. The show begins incorporating celebrity appearances at a rate that will eventually become overwhelming, with famous people appearing in Springfield with a frequency that would require the town to be a genuinely extraordinary destination, which it clearly is not. The shift is not subtle and it is not gradual. It happens with a before and an after, and the dividing line between those two states is the episode in which Homer Simpson flatlines and enters a coma. The coma theory's explanation for this is elegant. Before the coma, you were watching the real Simpsons, grounded in the reality of their actual lives. After the coma, you are watching the dream. And the dream, generated by a brain that is damaged and deteriorating, and trying to hold on to something it loves by running an increasingly elaborate simulation of it, follows different rules than reality does. Dreams escalate. Dreams become strange. Dreams introduce impossible elements without explanation, and then move on, as if nothing unusual has occurred. Dreams feature famous people in strange contexts. Dreams do not maintain internal consistency from scene to scene or from episode to episode. The show goes from domestic sitcom to surrealist adventure anthology not because the writers ran out of grounded ideas. It happens because the dreamer's brain started losing its grip on what was real. There is a specific piece of evidence from within the show's own narrative that makes this reading feel less like speculation and more like something the show was always aware of. 6 months before the coma episode, in the 4th season's premiere, the show aired an episode called Homer the Heretic. In that episode, Homer has a conversation with God, an actual face-to-face conversation with the divine, handled with characteristic Simpsons irreverence but also with genuine warmth and specificity. During that conversation, God tells Homer that he will eventually learn the meaning of life, but not yet. Homer's time is coming, God says, but it hasn't arrived. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline is precise. God tells Homer in September of 1992 that his time is nearly up, and in April of 1993, Homer's conscious life ends. What the show frames as a throwaway theological joke reads, through the lens of the coma theory, as a prophecy delivered without its recipient understanding what he was being told. God was not telling Homer that he would one day understand the meaning of existence. God was telling Homer that he was running out of time. And Homer laughed, because Homer always laughs. And 6 months later, the vending machine fell. Now consider the aging problem. Nobody in Springfield ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not accumulated a single visible year since the show began in 1989. The show uses what is called a floating timeline, where the present is always the present and the past reshapes itself to accommodate whatever the current episode requires, but the characters remain locked at their introductory ages forever. The radiation theory offers one explanation for this. The coma theory offers a different one, and it is arguably more emotionally complete. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went to sleep in April of 1993. Homer's unconscious brain cannot make his children older because it was not present to witness them growing. He last saw Bart as a 10-year-old, so Bart remains 10. He last saw Lisa as an 8-year-old, so the dream preserves her at 8. Maggie was 1 when the vending machine fell, and so Maggie remains 1, forever sucking on that pacifier in the corner of the dream. The brain in a coma does not have access to the world outside itself. It cannot update its model of reality by observing how that reality actually changes. It can only run and rerun the version of the world it had stored at the moment consciousness ended. Homer's dream is a perfect preservation of his family as they existed on the day he lost them. Every detail accurate, every relationship intact. The kids exactly the right age. Marge exactly as she was. The house on Evergreen Terrace exactly as he remembered it. That's what comas do to the mind. They lock you in place. The world freezes at the last moment you were present to experience it. The celebrity appearances, which become more frequent and more varied as the show progresses, find a compelling explanation in the coma theory as well. A brain in a hospital room is not experiencing nothing. It receives ambient stimulation from its environment constantly, sounds from the television in the room, voices from visitors, radio playing somewhere down the hall, a nurse mentioning something she read in a magazine, a doctor discussing a news story with a colleague outside the door. Homer's brain, receiving these fragments, processes them the way a dreaming brain always processes the real world's intrusions, by incorporating them into the dream. The celebrity appearances in Springfield are not the show becoming a prestige booking exercise. They are Homer's unconscious mind hearing names and voices through the fog of the hospital and weaving those fragments into the simulation. Every famous person who shows up in Springfield is a voice Homer heard from the outside world, translated into a dream character, and given a role in the story his brain is desperately trying to keep running. The show acknowledged this theory directly, which is itself a significant data point. In the show's 34th season, an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout included what was described as a deliberately leaked, fake-deleted scene in which Homer wakes up from a long coma to reveal that every outlandish thing that had ever happened on the show was simply a dream. The writers animated this scene. They showed it to the audience, and then they framed it as a hoax, as a scene planted by hackers, as something that was not real and should be dismissed. But the fact that they made it, that they took the time to animate a scene in which Homer wakes up from a coma and acknowledges that everything since was a dream, tells you something that the official denial cannot erase. The writers know the theory. They have engaged with it seriously enough to produce a direct response to it. Their response was constructed to function simultaneously as an acknowledgement and a dismissal, which is exactly what you would do if the theory was uncomfortably close to something you did not want to confirm. They showed you the truth and then told you it was a joke. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Homer laughed when he was told he had permanently lost 5% of his brain function. He laughed because laughing is easier than understanding. Springfield laughs because Springfield cannot afford to understand. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory in 2015. He said it was not true. He dismissed it as fan speculation. He did not explain why the show's tonal shift coincides precisely with the coma episode. He did not explain why nobody ages. He did not explain why the plots become progressively more surreal and detached from any recognizable domestic reality as the series progresses, following the exact trajectory you would expect from a dream being generated by a brain that is slowly losing its structural integrity. He said it isn't true, and the interviewer moved on. But the fans did not move on, because the theory does something that no official statement has done. It gives the show a coherent internal logic that accounts for everything that looks like a flaw: the aging freeze, the tonal shift, the celebrity flood, the increasingly implausible plots, the reset button that erases consequences between episodes, Homer's extraordinary resilience in the face of injuries that should be fatal. That last point deserves its own attention. Homer survives things that no human body could survive. He has been shot, electrocuted, fallen from great heights, been struck by cars moving at speed, survived explosions, and recovered from all of it with a consistency that, if you hold it up against the radiation theory's explanation of mutated biology, seems almost reasonable. But under the coma theory, the explanation is simpler and stranger. Homer survives everything because nothing is actually happening to his body. His body is in a hospital bed. It is not being shot or electrocuted or falling off anything. Only his mind is in Springfield, and his mind cannot die because his mind is the one telling the story. The dreaming brain protects its dreamer from death within the dream, not out of sentimentality, but because the dream ends when the dreamer does, and Homer's brain is not ready for the dream to end. Every time Homer should die and doesn't, it's not cartoon logic. It's the unconscious protective mechanism of a sleeping mind refusing to write its own ending. And here is the piece of the theory that stays with you. If the coma theory is true, then the show is not a comedy about a dysfunctional family, it is an elegy. It is 32 years of a dying man holding his family in his mind as carefully as he can, maintaining every detail with the precision of someone who knows that letting go of any of it means losing it forever. Homer's deepest wish is not complicated. He wants his family. He wants Marge to still be there. He wants Bart to still be his boy. He wants Lisa to still play her saxophone on Sunday mornings. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold in one hand while he sits on the couch and watches the game. The dream gives him all of it. The dream gives him his family preserved at the exact moment he loved them most. And it gives him episode after episode of coming home to them, of failing and recovering and failing again, and still having them at the end of it. Homer's coma is not a nightmare. It is the only version of heaven a man like Homer Simpson would ever think to ask for. A house on Evergreen Terrace where the beer is cold and the kids are young and nobody ever has to say goodbye. And every time the credits roll and the reset button is pressed and Sunday night begins again with the couch gag and the theme and the family sliding into their seats, it is Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, something worse than death awaits him. He would have to open his eyes and find out how much time has passed, how old his children actually are, whether Marge is still sitting beside the bed, whether anyone is. The show will never confirm this theory. The people who make it will continue to deny it when asked. But it will also never disprove it, because the evidence is not something that can be disproved from the outside. It is baked into the structure of the show itself, into the moment in 1993 when a vending machine fell and everything that was grounded became strange, and a family that was aging stopped aging, and a town that was recognizable became impossible. Nobody ages, reality keeps getting stranger, and Homer always finds his way home by the end of the episode. Because in the dream, he never left. Before we accept the official answer, let's agree on something. We know what the show told us. Season 7, Episode 1, Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 2, Maggie Simpson shot Mr. Burns. Baby. Did it. Case closed. Move on. Except the case was never closed. Not really. The case was filed. And in Springfield, filed and closed are two very different things. Let's go back to the summer of 1995, because what happened that summer was unlike anything American television had attempted with an animated series. The Simpsons constructed a genuine mystery, a whodunit designed with enough internal clues to be theoretically solvable, promoted nationally as something the audience could actually figure out before the answer was revealed. Fox ran promotional events around it. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special, treating the fictional shooting as if it were a real unsolved crime, complete with a dramatized timeline of events and a plea for the public to examine the evidence. The show invited its audience to participate in a contest. Submit your guess. If you're right, you get animated into a future episode. The stakes were real and the mystery was supposed to be solvable. So, let's understand what the mystery was built on. Mr. Burns had spent the episode that preceded the shooting, accumulating enemies at a rate that might have been impressive if it weren't so relentless. He stole an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary School, gutting the school's operating budget and eliminating programs that the students and faculty depended on. He shut down Moe's Tavern by financially ruining its owner. He created a sinkhole through industrial negligence that destroyed the Springfield retirement castle, displacing its elderly residents. He injured Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, in a way serious enough to require veterinary attention. And then, as his crowning act of civic destruction, he built a machine capable of blocking out the sun over the entire town of Springfield. Not metaphorically, not as a threat. He actually blocked the sun from reaching Springfield, with the explicit intention of forcing every resident to purchase electricity from his power plant, since natural light would no longer be available to them. When Wayland Smithers, his loyal assistant, and the one person in his life whose devotion had always been absolute, protested this scheme on moral grounds, Burns fired him on the spot. By the end of Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1, every person in Springfield had a reason to want Charles Montgomery Burns dead. The show spent the entire episode establishing this with considerable care. Homer, because Burns had employed him for years and still could not remember his name, an indignity that had reached the point of genuine psychological harm. Bart and Lisa, because the school lost its funding. Grandpa Simpson, because the retirement home was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because the oil discovery that Burns stole had briefly made him wealthy, and Burns took that away. Tito Puente, because Burns eliminated the music program. Moe, because his bar went under. The entire town gathered at a public meeting to confront Burns. The tension in the room was documented by the show through the detail that multiple characters were shown carrying weapons. Then Burns collapsed. A gunshot wound. He staggered to the town sundial and fell, his hands landing on two letters, W and S, from the perspective of someone looking at him. M and S, from Burns's own perspective. America waited through an entire summer. And when September arrived and the answer came, here's what we were told. The investigation, conducted with characteristic incompetence by the Springfield Police Department, produced a series of eliminated suspects. Smithers confessed immediately, but his confession collapsed when it became clear that he had been blackout drunk during the time of the shooting and had actually discharged his weapon at an entirely different person in an entirely different location. He shot Jasper in his wooden leg. Not Burns. Wrong victim. Wrong place. Wrong crime. Other suspects were eliminated through alibis. A DNA trace from an eyelash found on Burns's suit pointed to Homer, who had the strongest motive of anyone in town and whose fingerprints were on the gun. Homer was arrested and on the verge of being convicted when Burns woke from his coma, looked around the hospital room, and identified his attacker. It was Maggie, a baby. Burns claimed that after the town meeting, he had encountered Maggie in the parking lot and attempted to take her lollipop. During the struggle, his gun fell from its holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. Case closed. No jury in the world would convict a baby. Except the contest that was supposed to celebrate this answer produced essentially no correct guesses. The show's creators, speaking on DVD commentary for the episode, acknowledged that of all the entries randomly sampled from the thousands submitted, not a single one named Maggie as the shooter. The person who was awarded the prize did not have the correct answer. She received a cash payment instead of the promised animation appearance. The writers were aware of one person, posting on a Simpsons newsgroup online on the night of the original broadcast, who had identified Maggie correctly. This person was using a college account. By the time the producers tried to find them, the account was inactive. The one person who got it right disappeared without collecting the prize. Even on the DVD release, the producers issued an open invitation for that person to come forward. They never did. Think about what that means. The show designed a mystery it claimed was solvable from the clues in Part 1, built a national promotional campaign around its solvability, and then when the answer was revealed, essentially nobody had solved it. Either the clues were inadequate, the red herrings were too effective, or the answer did not actually follow from the evidence in the way the show's promotion implied it would. Let's look at the specific pieces of evidence the show presents for Maggie's guilt and examine each one with some care. The sundial. Burns falls and his hands point to W and S, or from his perspective, M and S. The show presents this as the central directional clue, pointing toward Maggie Simpson. But Burns himself, in the resolution of the mystery, explicitly states that his positioning on the sundial was not intentional. He did not deliberately arrange his hands to indicate his attacker's initials. He simply fell. The most prominent piece of physical evidence in the entire investigation was acknowledged by the victim as a coincidence. The clue is meaningless, according to the person it supposedly came from. The gun. This is perhaps the most interesting piece of evidence. Not because of what it says about Maggie, but because of what it says about the shooter. Burns carried a personal weapon in a holster. Prior to the shooting, the holster is shown empty. Burns's gun was already gone before he was shot, which means whoever shot him used his own weapon. They did not bring a gun to the confrontation. They were not armed. They encountered Burns's gun by chance and used it in a moment of either accident or impulse. A baby finding a gun on the ground and inadvertently discharging it fits this profile. So does any person who was not carrying a weapon that evening, who was not planning violence, who stumbled into proximity with Burns and found themselves holding his gun before understanding what was happening. Burns's last words before the shot are recorded as, "Oh, it's you." Not surprise, not fear, not the alarm of someone who sees a threat approaching. He recognized his attacker. He saw this person and felt, in the moment before he was shot, something like casual acknowledgement. The sort of recognition you extend to someone familiar, someone who does not represent danger in your mental model of the world. Does Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? Has he ever had a meaningful interaction with her prior to the events of this episode? The show does not establish any relationship between Burns and Maggie. Burns barely recognizes Homer, the man who has worked for him for years. The notion that Burns would see an infant he had never meaningfully interacted with and respond with the specific familiarity of, "Oh, it's you," rather than, "What is this baby doing out here?" does not align with what we know about how Burns's mind works. Now consider the theory that places Marge as the real shooter. The case is more coherent than it initially appears. Marge had watched Burns systematically destroy the things her family depended on: the school that educated her children, the dog that her children loved, the financial stability of people in her community. She is a mother. She is protective in ways that the show consistently depicts as running deeper than she typically expresses. And Burns, in a prior episode, had developed something like infatuation with Marge, a fixation that Marge rebuffed but that Burns retained. If Marge was the shooter, Burns's response makes immediate sense. He saw her approaching. He recognized her. He said, "It's you," with the quiet acknowledgement of a man who knows exactly who this is and understands in that moment what is about to happen. And when he woke from the coma and was asked to identify his attacker, he protected her. He pointed at the sundial. He let the letters mean whatever the investigating officers wanted them to mean. He took the opportunity that his injury provided to shield the woman he had once been fixated on from the consequences of what she did. Maggie became the answer because Maggie was the answer that ended the case, without ending anyone's life. Chief Wiggum says it out loud. No jury in the world would convict a baby. Maggie cannot be prosecuted. She cannot be sentenced. She cannot even be meaningfully questioned. She is the perfect person to blame if you need the investigation to stop and you need it to stop without destroying anyone's future. If someone in Springfield's informal power structure wanted to protect the real shooter, pointing at an infant who had been present at the scene was the cleanest available solution. And then there is Homer. In Season 18, Homer claims out loud and on camera that he was the one who shot Burns. He says it casually. Nobody reacts. Nobody reopens the case. Nobody calls the police. Homer Simpson confesses to the attempted murder of the richest and most powerful man in Springfield, and the show treats it as a throwaway line that passes without consequence. Either Homer is lying, which is entirely within his character, or the original verdict was wrong and Homer knows it because he is the one who actually pulled the trigger. If Homer did it, then Maggie was blamed for a crime her father committed, and the evidence used to support that conclusion, the DNA trace that pointed to a Simpson, the sundial that Burns said was meaningless, the testimony of a man who had just woken from a coma with a bullet wound and possible cognitive effects, was a collection of facts arranged into a story rather than a story that the facts naturally told. The alternate endings, which were fully animated and fully voiced, provide one final piece of context. A complete alternate resolution in which Smithers is the shooter was produced and later shown in a clip show episode where it was dismissed by the host on the grounds that the DNA evidence would have to be ignored for it to work, which the host calls downright nutty. The reference is explicit. During the time this episode aired, a real criminal trial in America had just concluded with a jury acquitting a defendant despite DNA evidence that prosecutors argued was definitive. The Simpsons writers were aware of this. They wrote a line into their clip show that directly referenced the phenomenon of juries setting aside DNA evidence, and then they used that line to dismiss an alternate ending rather than to explore it. They were not making a point about Smithers. They were making a point about evidence. Evidence can be presented and dismissed and rearranged depending on who is controlling the narrative. And in Springfield, the narrative is always controlled by the people with the most to lose from the truth. An early draft of the episode had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered this seriously for a time before abandoning it. The point is that the shooter was not predetermined from the beginning of the story. The clues were not laid down first and the answer derived from them. The answer was chosen, and the clues were arranged to support it. The mystery was reverse engineered, which means the clues in part 1 do not actually point to the truth. They point to wherever the writers eventually decided the story should land. And finally, the last shot of the resolution episode. Everyone has left the room. Maggie is alone. She looks around the room carefully, deliberately, confirming that she is unobserved. And then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics the pulling of a trigger. The show wants you to read this as Maggie confirming her guilt. She's alone. She's reenacting the crime. She knows what she did. But watch it again and consider the alternative. She is not confessing. She is remembering. She watched someone shoot Burns. She is 1 year old, and she watched an act of violence occur in front of her. And now, alone in a quiet room, she is replaying it the way that babies replay anything they have witnessed. By performing the motion again, by using their body to process something their brain cannot yet categorize or understand. Maggie isn't showing you her guilt. She's showing you what she saw. The official answer is Maggie Simpson. The show committed to it, the writers stand behind it. But the contest that nobody won, the sundial that Burns said was meaningless, the alternate endings that were fully produced, Homer's unaddressed confession in Season 18, and the final shot of Maggie alone in the room, repeating a motion she may have witnessed rather than performed, they are all still there. The greatest mystery in Simpsons history was never solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, those are not the same thing. Within the established continuity of The Simpsons, Charles Montgomery Burns is a medical impossibility. His age has never been stated with clean precision. because the show's floating timeline makes clean precision impossible to maintain. But every version of his backstory, every reference to personal memories, every historical event he has described as direct experience, places his birth somewhere in the final decades of the 19th century. Burns has described the Gilded Age not as history but as lived experience. He has discussed the Spanish-American War as a contemporary event he was present for. He served in World War II, though the nature of his service was, by his own description, morally complicated at best. He attended Yale. He knew Howard Hughes. He has told stories about working relationships with figures who died before most of the show's audience was born. By the most conservative estimate, Burns is well over 100 years old. By a more generous reading of the show's various timeline references, he could be approaching 140. And he does not merely exist, he functions. He runs a corporation. He manipulates local politics. He executes schemes that require sustained planning, detailed knowledge of modern finance and law, and strategic intelligence that none of his subordinates can match. His body is frail. His physical strength is almost non-existent, to the point where cartoon sight gags have been built around his inability to exert force on the world around him. But his mind is sharp in the specific way that predatory intelligence remains sharp. Not broad or curious or empathetic, but focused and patient and capable of taking the long view in situations where shorter-sighted people act impulsively. Burns has been operating at that level for longer than any human being should be capable of sustained thought. So how is he still here? The Springfield Files gives us the beginning of an answer. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive that it causes his body to emit visible light for hours afterward. The treatment must be administered on a precise 7-day schedule. Miss one appointment, and Burns dies. The margin for error is zero. His life is maintained the way you maintain complex machinery, through scheduled servicing, with the understanding that any lapse in maintenance produces catastrophic and immediate failure. And the treatment involves radiation. Of course it does. The man who owns and operates a nuclear power plant, the man whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's environment for decades, is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to sustain his own biological functions. Burns is not merely profiting from nuclear power, he is powered by it. His body has been so fundamentally altered by decades of proximity to nuclear material, beginning long before the Springfield plant was constructed, that it can no longer sustain itself through normal cellular processes. He requires external radiation input the way an ordinary person requires food and water. Remove it, and his systems begin shutting down within a week. This creates a closed loop that the show depicts without fully articulating, because articulating it would make the horror of it too explicit for a Sunday night animated series. Burns has access to radiation therapy that keeps him alive. That therapy is only possible because he owns the infrastructure needed to produce and administer it. The power plant is not simply his business, it is his life support system. And every person in Springfield who depends on that plant for electricity is, by extension, contributing to the survival of the man who is poisoning them. Springfield funds Burns' immortality. Springfield sustains the plant sustains Burns. Burns sustains the plant, and the circle closes. The most famous medical scene in the show's history is the one in which Burns visits a doctor and is informed that he has every disease known to medical science. Every single one, simultaneously. The doctor explains this through what he calls Three Stooges syndrome. Each illness is present in Burns' body. Each illness is trying to kill him. But because all of them are present at once, they exist in a state of perfect equilibrium where each one prevents the others from advancing. The diseases are gridlocked. None of them can move. And Burns, the sickest man in the United States by any clinical measure, is functionally indestructible because everything that should kill him is being blocked by everything else that should kill him. The show plays this as comedy. It is one of the most quoted scenes in the series. But under the radiation theory, it makes a kind of terrible sense. Burns' disease equilibrium is not the result of extraordinary luck or some unique biological quirk. It is the result of the weekly treatments. The radiation therapy does not cure his diseases. It manages them. It keeps every illness in precise stasis, balanced against every other illness, preventing any single condition from gaining enough dominance to kill the host. It is not medicine in any conventional sense. It is nuclear maintenance. Burns' body is, functionally, a reactor. and the weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods to prevent a cascade failure. This is why Smithers's role is more than devotional. The show consistently depicts Smithers as managing Burns's schedule with an attention that borders on the obsessive. He monitors Burns's physical condition. He ensures Burns makes every appointment. He knows the treatment protocol in detail. He has said, across multiple episodes and in multiple ways, that Burns is helpless without him. And the show confirms this. When Smithers is removed from his position, Burns deteriorates. Not emotionally, though that too, but physically. He cannot sustain himself. Smithers is not simply a loyal assistant whose devotion has made him indispensable. He is the administrator of Burns's life support system. His logistical competence is the mechanism that keeps the weekly treatments happening on schedule, which is the mechanism that keeps the disease equilibrium maintained, which is the mechanism that keeps Burns alive. Smithers understands this. Burns understands this. The devotion in their relationship is real, but beneath it is a medical dependency that has been formalized into their working relationship over the course of decades. If Smithers ever left, Burns would not simply be sad. Burns would be dead within 7 days. Burns's engagement with historical events adds another layer to the immortality question. The show has depicted him interacting with or personally referencing an extraordinary range of historical moments across more than a century. He attended Yale at a time when Yale was educating a very different kind of American elite. He served in the military during the Second World War, in a capacity that the show hints was not strictly honorable. He was present for, or involved in, events that took place before most modern institutions existed. His family wealth predates the Industrial Revolution. The Burns dynasty, as the show depicts it, is one of the oldest continuously powerful lineages in American history. Not simply wealthy by any ordinary measure, but influential at the level where wealth becomes structural, where money stops being a resource and becomes an environment. The kind of wealth that builds the roads and charges everyone else to use them. The kind of wealth that does not merely exist within systems of power, but constitutes those systems. And Burns has been the head of this dynasty for over a century, which raises a question the show never answers directly. Is Burns unique in his longevity? Or has the Burns family always had access to methods of extending their hold on power beyond what natural human lifespan would permit? Before the nuclear age, before the radiation treatments that are currently keeping Burns alive, did previous generations of the Burns family use other methods? The show establishes that the dynasty has been in continuous control of its fortune for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of continuity does not emerge from normal generational succession. It requires either a run of luck so extraordinary as to be statistically implausible, or it requires something more deliberate. The show does not say which, but the pattern is there if you are looking for it. Burns has come closer to dying than almost any character in the show's history. He was shot by Maggie Simpson, or whoever actually shot him, and survived. He has been hospitalized, collapsed, attacked, poisoned, and abandoned in environments that would be fatal to an ordinarily constituted person. He always comes back. And crucially, the way he comes back is different from the way Homer comes back. Homer survives things because the show needs him to survive. His recovery is a narrative function. Burns survives because he has spent a century engineering a system specifically designed to ensure his survival regardless of what happens to his physical form. There will always be someone standing by with resources to intervene. There will always be a doctor who knows the protocol. There will always be Smithers, managing the calendar, making sure the appointment is kept. Homer's immortality is passive. It happens to him. Burns's immortality is something he built. Every dollar Burns has ever spent, every institution he has corrupted, every politician he has purchased, every academic medical researcher he has retained, it all serves one purpose. Keep Burns alive. Keep the treatments coming. Keep the diseases balanced. Keep the reactor running. Because if Burns stops, the empire stops. And empires, as a rule, do not permit themselves to stop. The scariest dimension of the Burns immortality question is not that he might live forever. It is the dependency it creates in the people around him. Springfield's economy runs through the power plant. The power plant runs because Burns runs it. Burns runs it because the treatments keep him functional. The treatments are possible because the infrastructure of Burns's wealth supports them. The infrastructure of Burns's wealth persists because the plant generates income. The plant generates income because Springfield has no other primary employer. Everything feeds into everything else. The town cannot kill Burns, even if it wanted to, because killing Burns would collapse the system that the town depends on to exist. And Burns cannot die, because dying would mean the Empire finally has to answer for what it has done to the people living inside it. He is not immortal, he is too expensive to die. And Springfield has been paying the bill, in irradiated water and three-eyed fish and children born with yellow skin and 4 fingers, for as long as the lights have been on, which, if the treatment schedule holds, is going to be a very long time. Maggie Simpson is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She does not speak in any meaningful or sustained way. She communicates primarily through facial expression, the occasional deliberate gesture, and the rhythmic motion of a pacifier that she has never removed in the entire documented history of the Simpson family. She cannot reliably walk without falling. She has not developed language in any way that would be recognizable to a developmental psychologist as normal for her supposed stage of growth. She is the quietest member of the family. She is the easiest to overlook. She is the one who gets left in the car, mentioned as an afterthought, handed off to daycare providers and babysitters and the passive supervision of whatever adult happens to be nearby. She requires constant care, apparently, and yet she is consistently treated as requiring the least attention of anyone in the household. And in the space that the family's inattention creates, something extraordinary has been happening for 3 decades. Let's begin with the shooting, because the shooting is the event that defined Maggie in public consciousness, and we have already spent considerable time questioning whether the official account of it is accurate. But whether Maggie intentionally pulled that trigger, or whether she was holding a gun that discharged by accident, or whether she is being blamed for something she witnessed rather than committed, the aftermath is what matters for the purposes of understanding who Maggie Simpson actually is. A baby was identified as the person who shot the wealthiest man in town. The police investigated. The evidence was examined. And the conclusion reached by the justice system of Springfield was that this infant had committed an act of violence against a grown man and that nothing could be done about it. Chief Wiggum stated this explicitly. No jury in the world would convict a baby. And then the investigation ended, and everyone moved on. Everyone except Maggie. Because in the final moments of the resolution episode, after every other character has left the room, Maggie is alone. She looks around the room with a deliberateness that is not reflexive. She checks her surroundings. She confirms that she is unobserved. And then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. A baby randomly moving her mouth does not first scan the room to confirm she is not being watched. A reflexive or accidental gesture does not require situational awareness as a prerequisite. The sequence of behaviors Maggie performs in that final shot of the episode requires memory of what happened, awareness of the significance of those events, understanding that performing this particular gesture in front of others would have consequences, and the impulse control to wait until she is certain she is unobserved before performing it. Those are not the cognitive characteristics of a 1-year-old. They are the cognitive characteristics of someone who understands exactly what they are doing and has decided that secrecy is the optimal strategy. Now let's look at The Longest Daycare. In 2012, The Simpsons released a theatrical short film screened in cinemas before a feature film. It ran 7 minutes. It was nominated for an Academy Award. And in those 7 minutes, Maggie Simpson demonstrated intelligence that would be remarkable in an adult operating under ideal conditions, let alone a baby with the physical limitations of a 1-year-old. The setup is simple. Maggie is dropped off at the Ayn Rand School for Tots, a daycare facility run with institutional efficiency and no particular warmth. Inside, Maggie encounters a caterpillar in the process of becoming a butterfly. She wants to protect it. Another infant, a bully who appears throughout the series as her recurring antagonist, wants to destroy it. What follows is a 7-minute sequence in which Maggie outmaneuvers the bully, the daycare staff, and the facility's various security and operational systems to protect the caterpillar and release the butterfly safely. She does this without speaking a word. What the film documents, if you watch it as evidence rather than entertainment, is a display of cognitive function that goes well beyond what any child at her developmental stage should possess. She reads her environment and identifies threats with accuracy. She develops a strategy and then adapts that strategy in real time when obstacles appear. She executes multi-step plans that require precise timing, spatial awareness, and the ability to accurately predict other people's behavior before they act. Her body barely keeps up. She falls. She crawls when she should be running. Her physical limitations are real and consistent with her apparent age, but her decision-making is essentially flawless. Every choice she makes is correct. Every move she makes is optimized for the outcome she has decided she wants. She is operating at a cognitive level that her physical development cannot support. And she succeeds anyway, because her intelligence compensates for every limitation her body imposes. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence directly, across different episodes, with results that vary somewhat in their specifics but remain consistent in their implication. She is not a normal baby. In certain episodes, her measured intelligence registers as extraordinary, beyond the scale of whatever assessment tool is being used. The show moves on from these moments quickly, treating them as punchlines rather than revelations. But the pattern accumulates. Maggie consistently demonstrates cognitive abilities that no one-year-old should possess, and the family consistently fails to notice because the family is too occupied with Homer's disasters and Bart's provocations and Lisa's campaigns to pay sustained attention to the baby who is quietly resolving situations in the background. The silence is the key to all of it. Maggie's defining characteristic is not her intelligence. It is the fact that she does not reveal her intelligence. And the reason she does not reveal it is because she has been watching what happens to intelligent people in the Simpson household since the day she was old enough to process what she was seeing. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. The show has established this consistently and without ambiguity. Lisa has an IQ that places her well above everyone else in her household and most of the adults in Springfield. She is musically accomplished, academically distinguished, and morally rigorous in ways that her family and community consistently fail to match. She is, by almost any measure, the most cognitively capable member of her family. And what has that intelligence gotten her? Isolation. Almost entirely. Lisa speaks up and gets dismissed. Lisa raises legitimate concerns and gets ignored, or patronized, or told that she is being too sensitive, too serious, too difficult. Lisa tries to improve the world around her and watches the world push back with a force that is proportional to the clarity of her vision. Her intelligence is her greatest gift and her heaviest burden simultaneously, because she cannot stop seeing the things that are wrong, and the world around her cannot stop not caring. Maggie has watched this happen. Maggie has been watching it happen from the day she arrived in the family. She watched her sister fight every day for recognition and receive nothing but resistance in return. She watched the most capable person in the household be consistently overlooked and undervalued by a family and a community that rewards amiable mediocrity and punishes genuine insight. And she drew the opposite conclusion from the one Lisa drew. Lisa's lesson was to keep fighting, regardless of the cost, because the truth is worth fighting for even when the world is indifferent to it. That is a noble lesson. It is also one that has made Lisa consistently miserable. Maggie learned something else. She learned that the less you reveal about yourself, the more freedom you have. She learned that being underestimated is not a disadvantage. It is an extraordinary strategic position. She learned that if you maintain the appearance of helplessness, the people around you will drop their guard in ways that make them fundamentally vulnerable to you. Think about every remarkable thing Maggie has accomplished, and then think about whether the family noticed. Burns was shot and the investigation focused on everyone except the baby, because who genuinely suspects a baby? The daycare rebellion she led succeeded specifically because no one monitors infants closely enough to see them organizing. Every heroic act, every display of extraordinary cognition, every moment where Maggie saves a situation that was beyond anyone else's ability to resolve, it happens in the margins. It happens in the spaces where no one is paying close attention. And Maggie has ensured that no one pays close attention to her by maintaining, with perfect consistency across 3 decades, the most effective disguise available to her. She pretends to be exactly what everyone expects a baby to be: quiet, passive, dependent, present but not particularly relevant to the adult matters unfolding around her. She is none of those things. She is their opposite. Connect this to the radiation theory, and the picture becomes stranger. If Springfield's contaminated environment produces mutations that affect each organism differently, as the evidence clearly suggests, then Maggie and Homer represent the opposite poles of what that mutation can do. Homer's exposure reduced his cognitive function to clinical disability. Maggie's exposure amplified hers to levels that standard testing cannot adequately measure. Same family, same house, same water, same air. Same cracked cooling towers looming over the same neighborhood. But where the father's brain was diminished, the daughter's was supercharged. Homer and Maggie are two versions of the same radioactive outcome, pointing in opposite directions. He is what happens when mutation takes something away. She is what happens when mutation gives something that should not exist. And if the coma theory is true, Maggie's genius takes on a different and more heartbreaking quality. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode since 1993 is the product of an unconscious mind trying to preserve his family in amber, then Maggie's intelligence is not a mutation, it is a wish. It is Homer's deepest hope for his youngest child, the one who was barely old enough to form a face in his memory when the vending machine fell. He cannot see her grow. He cannot watch her learn to walk properly, or hear her speak in sentences, or find out what kind of person she becomes. So in the dream, he makes her extraordinary. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her age. He makes her capable of things no one-year-old could actually do. Because in the coma, Homer needs to believe, more than anything, that Maggie is going to be okay, that she can protect herself, that she can navigate whatever world she is living in without him there to provide the clumsy and inconsistent protection he always tried to give. Her genius in the dream is not a fact about Maggie, it is a father's prayer. But back in Springfield, in whatever version of Springfield is actually real, there is a darker reading available. Maggie does not speak because she has observed that speaking gets you nothing in this town. She does not reveal her intelligence because intelligence is what gets you treated the way Lisa is treated. She watches everything. She processes everything. She understands everything that happens around her with a completeness that no one in her family can match. And she waits. The show never tells us what she is waiting for. Maggie's endgame is genuinely unresolved, which makes her the only Simpson whose future is completely unknown. The show has imagined futures for the other family members in various flash-forward episodes. It has never definitively revealed what Maggie becomes, what she does with the intelligence and the patience and the 3 decades of careful observation she has been accumulating behind that pacifier. We have seen glimpses. We saw her shoot a man, or be blamed for shooting a man, or witness someone shooting a man. We saw her lead a room full of infants through a rebellion against institutional authority. We saw her solve problems that left the adults around her baffled. We saw her confirm or deny a person's innocence with a single, deliberate nod, and we saw the people around her accept that nod as authoritative. The family trusts Maggie's judgment implicitly. They just do not understand that they are doing it. Maggie Simpson is 1 year old. She cannot walk without falling. She cannot speak beyond a few sounds. She has never told anyone what she thinks, what she wants, what she knows, what she has figured out about the people and the place and the situation she was born into. And she is the most capable person on Evergreen Terrace. The only thing standing between Springfield and whatever Maggie decides to do, when she finally decides to do it, is Maggie's own patience, her own calculation that the moment has not yet arrived. Behind that pacifier, behind those enormous eyes that take in everything and give back nothing, something has been thinking. Something has been planning. Something has been watching Springfield with an intelligence that nobody suspects and nobody could contain if they did. When Maggie finally acts, when she finally breaks the silence and shows what she has been building toward for 36 years of deliberate invisibility, Springfield will not see it coming. Nobody will. That is exactly how she designed it. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story, maintained with the quiet certainty of something that is simply accepted and never examined. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, told him that his mother had died when Homer was young. He showed Homer a grave. Homer mourned, in the way that Homer mourns things, which is with a dull and constant ache that he buries under food and television and the daily labor of not thinking about it too directly. He grew up believing he was a boy whose mother had died, and he carried that belief into his adult life without question. That belief shaped everything about Homer that the show depicts as fundamental to his character: his desperate need for validation, his terror of abandonment, his compulsive desire to be liked by people who have given him no particular reason to expect their approval, his willingness to absorb humiliation, degradation, and casual cruelty from Burns without complaint because the alternative, the possibility of losing the one stable anchor in his adult life, which is his family, is worse than any individual indignity. Homer Simpson's entire personality, The neediness and the clinginess and the desperate seeking of approval and the inability to leave situations that are clearly bad for him is a coping mechanism for maternal loss. And in Season 7, the show revealed that the loss was a lie. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired in November of 1995, and it is widely and consistently considered one of the greatest pieces of television the show has ever produced. Here is what it reveals. Homer's mother is not dead. She never died. The grave Abe showed him was not his mother's grave. It was the grave of Walt Whitman, the poet, which Abe had been presenting as his wife's burial site for the entirety of Homer's life. Abe looked at his son's grief and decided that a convenient lie was preferable to the truth, so he maintained the lie for decades. Homer discovers this through a bureaucratic accident. He goes to the Hall of Records to correct an error in the municipal death registry, and he finds that according to official documentation, his mother is alive. He finds Mona at a cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave, mourning a child she was told had died. They have not seen each other since Homer was a small boy. She does not recognize him at first. He has changed in the ways that a person changes across 27 years of living in their mother's absence. When they find each other, the scene that the show produces is one of the most genuinely emotional moments in 36 years of programming. A grown man and his mother, separated for 27 years, finding each other beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them. And then Mona tells him the truth. She did not die. She did not leave because she stopped loving him. She did not leave because there was something about him that made her want to be elsewhere. She left because staying would have put Homer and Abe in danger, because the man who employed Homer, who had employed Homer for his entire adult life without ever learning his name, had destroyed her life and forced her underground, because she had no choice. The story begins in 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife. She was married to Abe, living a quiet life in Springfield while the world outside was burning through a decade of social upheaval. The civil rights movement, the counterculture, the protests against the war in Vietnam, the particular energy of a moment when large numbers of ordinary people were confronting the institutions around them with a directness that felt new and dangerous and necessary. Mona was radicalized. She joined a group of activists, and their target was a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Let that sit for a moment. Burns did not only own a nuclear power plant, he owned a facility for manufacturing biological weapons in Springfield. In the same community where Homer was growing up, where children were playing in neighborhoods within driving distance of a laboratory producing pathogenic agents designed to kill, Burns was manufacturing weaponized disease in the town he would later poison with nuclear runoff, and apparently the two were not considered contradictory by anyone in a position to stop him. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They detonated what the show calls an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agents stored inside. During the raid, by accident, they cured the asthma of the facility's security guard, who happened to be Clancy Wiggum, the man who would later become Springfield's chief of police. Wiggum's asthma was cured by the weapon designed to destroy the biological weapons, which is exactly the kind of detail The Simpsons has always hidden in plain sight. The raid succeeded. The agents were destroyed. But in the chaos of the escape, Mona stopped. She stopped because someone had been knocked down in the confusion, and she could not keep running past a person who needed help. That person was Mr. Burns. She stopped to assist the man whose weapons she had just destroyed. She was a woman who had been radicalized by conscience and was driven by principle, and her principle in that moment overrode her self-interest. She helped him. He looked at her face. He recognized her. He reported her to the FBI. From that moment, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact her family. She could not explain to her child why she was leaving, because any explanation would require revealing details that would put him at risk. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping, and she disappeared into the night. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead, and Homer spent the next 27 years of his life believing that he was the kind of person whose mother would rather vanish than stay. That there was something in him, some fundamental deficiency, that made love conditional and temporary and always subject to withdrawal without explanation. That belief is the architecture of Homer Simpson's psychology. But here is the layer of the conspiracy that extends beyond Mona's exile. When Mona returns to Springfield in the Season 7 episode, Burns recognizes her almost immediately. He spots her through a cab window while she is in the city with Homer. He calls the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time, and this time he knows why she is leaving. He knows who forced it. He knows that the man responsible for destroying his family is the man who signs his paychecks every week. And Homer does not connect the dots. He does not confront Burns. He does not quit. He does not even seem to fully process the relationship between these two facts. The man who employs him is the man who took his mother away when he was a small child, and Homer continues showing up to work the following Monday. The show does not play this as a joke, it plays it as quiet tragedy, because Homer's inability to make this connection is not stupidity in the ordinary sense. It is the specific cognitive impairment of a man who has been damaged by his environment, by his history, and by a foreign object in his brain, to the point where the architecture of his own suffering is invisible to him. He can feel the weight of it without being able to name its source. And that is exactly what Burns needs. Burns did not simply ruin Mona's life, he engineered Homer's. By driving Mona away when Homer was 6 years old, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up emotionally damaged in precisely the ways that make a person a compliant and uncomplaining employee. Desperate for approval from authority figures, terrified of abandonment, incapable of challenging the people who hold power over him, because challenging them might mean losing the only stability he has. Grateful for whatever scraps of acknowledgement come his way. Burns knew what he was creating. He may not have planned every detail of it consciously, but the outcome was one that served him perfectly. The broken version of Homer Simpson is exactly the kind of worker that a man running an illegal facility needs in a safety-critical role. Someone who shows up. Someone who does not ask questions. Someone who can be relied upon to not notice the things that should be noticed and to not report the things that should be reported, because his need to keep his job, his need to maintain the one external structure that gives his life coherence, is stronger than any other motivation he has. The show adds a structural confirmation to this in a later season, through a revelation about the relationship between Burns and Grandpa Simpson. Burns had committed a crime. Abe discovered it. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would always have a job at the plant, no matter how many violations Homer caused. No matter how many times his performance would normally justify termination. The number the show eventually provides is 742 documented errors, and Homer was never permanently dismissed, because the deal Abe made with Burns meant that Homer's continued employment was contractually guaranteed. Homer's job security was not a cartoon convenience. It was not the show lazily refusing to face the consequences of Homer's incompetence. It was a real agreement made in secret between Homer's father and his mother's persecutor, maintained in silence for decades, never explained to Homer because explaining it would mean explaining everything else. 3 generations of the Simpson family, broken by one man's grudge and one town's inability to resist him. Abe made a deal with the devil and buried the truth so deep that the truth became invisible, even to the family it destroyed. Mona fought back with the best tools she had and lost everything for it. And Homer inherited the consequences without understanding their origin, stumbled into working for the man who caused them, and spent his entire adult life in the exact position Burns designed for him. When the crayon is removed in season 12 and Homer becomes briefly intelligent, the show gives us a glimpse of who Homer could have been. Articulate, thoughtful, aware of the world around him, with a clarity that transforms every relationship he has. The man who exists inside Homer's skull, trapped behind decades of accumulated damage, is someone genuinely remarkable. That man was taken away from Homer before Homer was old enough to know what was being taken. Burns drove out the mother who would have nurtured that intelligence. The contaminated environment eroded it further. The crayon suppressed what remained. And by the time Homer was old enough to understand what had happened to him, the capacity to understand it was gone. Mona Simpson died in a later season. The show handles her death with a quietness that is unlike its usual relationship with mortality. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches her go. No joke. No reset. Just a man and his mother and 27 stolen years pressing down on both of them at once. The Simpsons is, underneath everything, a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But underneath the comedy, underneath 36 seasons of Homer falling down and getting back up and strangling his son and forgetting what he learned and doing it all again the following Sunday, there is a story about a family that was deliberately and systematically broken by one man's decision to protect his empire from a woman who tried to hold it accountable. Mona fought. She lost. Abe made his peace with the enemy. Homer was broken before he ever understood what wholeness felt like. And Burns won, the way Burns always wins, which is by making sure that the people who might challenge him are too damaged or too dependent or too afraid of losing what little they have to mount any real opposition. Burns always wins, because in Springfield, the man who controls the money writes the rules. And the rules say that Homer Simpson will work at the power plant until the last day he is capable of working, because his grandfather made a deal and his mother made a choice, and the richest man in town needed a broken man in Sector 7G. And Homer was broken long before he ever clocked in for his first shift. There is one episode in the history of The Simpsons that the show's fans remember as a betrayal. An act of storytelling so egregious, so contemptuous of continuity and character, that it has been cited for nearly 3 decades as the definitive moment when the show stopped caring. The episode is Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper. It aired on September 28, 1997, and the backlash was immediate, intense, and has never fully subsided. Harry Shearer, who voices Principal Skinner, publicly expressed his displeasure. Critics called it the point where The Simpsons betrayed its audience's trust. Fans rank it consistently among the worst episodes ever produced. Here is what happens. Springfield Elementary holds a celebration honoring Principal Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. A stranger walks in during the celebration. Nobody recognizes him. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war in Southeast Asia and presumed dead, who survived the prison camp and escaped, and who came home after 20 years to find that someone else had been living his life. The man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner is an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. He was, before the war, a street criminal with no prospects and no identity worth preserving. He was drafted, served in the same unit as the real Skinner, and when Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt guilt sharp enough to drive him to seek out Skinner's family. He came to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to his mother Agnes. Agnes assumed Tamzarian was her son. She needed him to be. And Tamzarian, who had never been needed by anyone, who had never had a family or a home or a reason to stay anywhere, chose to become Skinner. He took his name, his rank, his history, his relationship with Agnes, and he built an entire life inside a stolen identity for 20 years. And then the real Skinner walked through the door. The truth is fully exposed. Every person in Springfield knows the principal is a fraud. The man who has been running their children's school, participating in their community, navigating his strange and often tortured relationship with Bart Simpson, was never who he claimed to be, not even close. Now here's the part that fans have spent 27 years calling a betrayal. The town holds a meeting. The real Seymour Skinner is present. Armin Tamzarian is present. The truth is on the table, undeniable, in front of everyone. And Springfield votes. Not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian. Not on whether to return the real Skinner's identity to him. They vote on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The verdict is unanimous. They keep the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree, enforceable under the laws of Springfield, that Armin Tamzarian is Seymour Skinner. Legally, officially, permanently. The real Seymour Skinner, the man who survived a prisoner of war camp and crossed an ocean to reclaim his own life, is tied to a railroad car and physically removed from Springfield. And the judge makes it explicitly illegal, under penalty of torture, to ever mention the truth again. Fans called this a betrayal. The criticism was fierce and not without justification. Skinner's entire character, his military service, his relationship with Agnes, his dynamic with Bart, everything the audience had understood about him for 8 seasons was retroactively rendered fictional within the show's own continuity. Everything we knew about him was built on a lie. The episode destroyed the character by revealing that the character had never quite existed. But here is the reading that the fan criticism misses. The episode did not betray Springfield. It described Springfield with more clarity and honesty than any other episode in the show's history. It showed you what Springfield has always been. It just showed it out loud, explicitly, in daylight, rather than in the quiet background where it usually operates. Springfield has always voted to sustain the comfortable lie over the inconvenient truth. The town has always agreed to forget whatever disrupts the narrative. Every catastrophic event, every world-altering discovery, every revelation that should permanently change the way the community understands itself, has been followed by a reset, By the following episode, nothing has changed. Nobody references what happened. The slate is clean. Fans call this episodic storytelling, which is the industry term for we reset between episodes because continuity is complicated. The coma theory calls it a dreaming brain resetting between cycles. The radiation theory calls it the cognitive effect of chronic neurological damage from long-term contamination. But the principal and the pauper offers a fourth explanation, the most uncomfortable one. Springfield resets because the town chooses to reset, collectively, deliberately, through an unspoken social contract that has been maintained across decades and that says, we do not acknowledge what happened. We maintain the agreed-upon version of events. We treat the lie as truth and the truth as a criminal offense. And anyone who cannot honor this contract, anyone who insists on remembering what the rest of us have decided to forget, will be removed from the community. The episode makes this mechanism visible. It shows you the vote. It shows you the legal decree. It shows you the railroad car. It shows you the moment when a community collectively decides that honesty is less valuable than stability and takes formal institutional action to enforce that decision. Every other time Springfield forgets a catastrophe, it happens off-screen between episodes. The dome is sealed over the town in the film, and by the following week, everything is fine and nobody mentions it. The sun is blocked and then unblocked, and the following episode proceeds as if the entire town had not been threatened with extinction. Homer discovers that Burns is keeping his mother from him, and by the following week, he is back at the power plant, unchanged. The principal and the pauper is the one time the show let you watch the machinery of forgetting operate in real time. It showed you the mechanism that produces every other reset, every other return to normal, every other seamless erasure of something that should have permanently altered the town's understanding of itself. Consider the things Springfield has experienced that should have been permanently transformative. The town has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. It has been sealed under a federal containment dome. It has survived nuclear near misses and environmental catastrophes of a scale that would require years of recovery and investigation in any real community. It has confronted the direct evidence that its primary employer is conducting environmental crimes against its population. And every time, by the following week, none of it has happened. If you understand this as the result of the vote in The Principal and the Pauper, if you understand Springfield's amnesia as a deliberate and collective social choice rather than narrative convenience, then the show is telling you something specific and deeply uncomfortable about how communities actually function. Small towns in particular have an extraordinary capacity for collective denial. Scandals get buried not because no one witnessed them, but because everyone decides, often without explicit discussion, that witnessing them publicly would be more damaging than pretending they did not occur. Crimes get reattributed to more convenient narratives. Uncomfortable truths get rewritten through repetition and social pressure until the official version is the only version that anyone can access from memory. Springfield didn't invent this. Springfield is a cartoon about this. The Principal and the Pauper makes the mechanism visible because the show, in that particular episode, decided that showing you how it works was more important than maintaining the comfortable pretense that the reset happens naturally. It showed you that the reset is a choice. It showed you the committee that makes the choice, and the judge who ratifies it, and the railroad car that removes anyone who might insist on an alternative. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's experiment in what happens when the truth walks into the room and refuses to leave politely. He was a man with proof that the official narrative was a fiction, and the town's response was not gratitude or accountability or even embarrassment. It was criminalization and exile. Truth arrived in Springfield with documentation and a face and a name, and Springfield tied it to a train. That's not a comedy beat. That's a diagnosis. And if the coma theory is true, this episode carries an additional and darker resonance. If everything since season 4 is Homer's dream, then Homer's unconscious mind created this exact scenario, a town that votes to sustain a lie because the truth would be too destructive to absorb. Because the fake version of a life, the one built on a stolen identity and a maintained fiction, can be legitimized through collective agreement if enough people decide they need it to be real. Because that is what Homer's coma is. A fake life replacing a real one. A dream masquerading as waking experience. And as long as Springfield keeps voting to maintain the fiction, as long as everyone agrees to treat the dream as real and punish anyone who suggests otherwise, Homer never has to wake up. Armin Tamzarian is still pretending to be Seymour Skinner. Springfield is still pretending everything is fine, and somewhere, tied to a railroad car, the last honest man in town is heading away from the only life he ever had, expelled from it by Democratic vote. The episode is not the worst thing The Simpsons ever did. It is the most honest thing The Simpsons ever did. It just felt like a betrayal, because honesty in Springfield usually feels like that. At some point in the past decade, something happened to the way people talk about The Simpsons. The show stopped being primarily discussed as a piece of entertainment and started being discussed as something stranger, something almost prophetic. The claim, repeated with increasing frequency and conviction across social media platforms, is simple. The Simpsons predicts the future. The show, which has been running since 1989 and has produced nearly 800 episodes of satirical content, appears with uncanny regularity to have depicted events, technologies, and cultural moments before they actually occurred. The most famous example is well documented. In the year 2000, an episode called Bart to the Future depicted a future United States in which Lisa Simpson has become president. During the episode, Lisa's predecessor in the White House is identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the presidency in 2016. When Trump won, screenshots from the episode went viral. The Simpsons predicted Trump became a phrase that entered mainstream culture. People who hadn't watched the show in years were sharing clips and asking the same question. How did they know? The list of apparent predictions extends considerably beyond this single famous example. In a 1995 episode, the show depicted a device worn on the wrist that functions as a communication and information tool, with a design that looks remarkably similar to what would later be marketed as a smartwatch. In a 1994 episode, Homer travels to space alongside an actual former astronaut in a storyline that predates commercial space tourism, becoming a real industry by decades. In a 1998 episode, Homer discovers a mathematical equation that appears to predict the mass of the Higgs boson particle, a real particle in theoretical physics that would not be experimentally confirmed by scientists until 2012. In a 1999 episode, Homer proposes a theory about the shape of the universe that resembles a donut shape, and years later, cosmologists studying radiation patterns found evidence suggesting the universe might have a toroidal geometry. In a 1993 episode, a flu virus originating in Asia spreads to Springfield and causes mass panic buying, and a frantic community-wide search for a cure. The episode aired 27 years before a pandemic originating in Asia caused exactly those responses globally. In 1996, an episode featured a joke about a hip-hop group accidentally booking a classical orchestra for a performance while under the influence of various substances. That exact collaboration actually took place in 2024, when the hip-hop group in question performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at a famous concert venue. In a 1998 episode, the show depicted a large media corporation acquiring a smaller entertainment company in a storyline that served as satire about corporate consolidation. The specific acquisition depicted in the show actually occurred 21 years later. Across multiple episodes spanning decades, the show depicted video calling, autocorrect failures on mobile devices, and the cultural phenomenon of surveillance becoming normalized in everyday life, all before those technologies and cultural shifts were part of ordinary experience. The list is long enough to constitute its own dedicated examination, and there is a genuine industry around documenting and categorizing these apparent predictions. Every time a new one surfaces, the internet responds with the same mixture of astonishment and half-serious suspicion. So how does it actually work? What is actually happening when an episode from 1997 appears to map precisely onto a headline from 2025? The people who make the show have answered this question directly, and their answer is worth taking seriously before we get to the more interesting interpretation. Al Jean, who has served as executive producer on The Simpsons across multiple periods of its run, has addressed the prediction phenomenon bluntly. His explanation is essentially statistical. If you throw enough darts, some of them will hit the target. The show has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, satirical observations, and references to American culture, technology, politics, and social life. When you generate that volume of content over that time frame, some portion of it is going to align with future events through the operation of statistical probability alone. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during some of its most celebrated seasons, was more direct still. There are very few cases where the show predicted anything, he has said. Mostly it is coincidence, because the episodes are old enough that history repeats itself. That is the official position from inside the production. Volume, coincidence, and the cyclical tendency of history to revisit similar patterns. Organizations that professionally evaluate factual claims have systematically examined many of the most popular supposed predictions and found explanations that are considerably less dramatic than prophecy. Many of the apparent predictions are based on trends that were already clearly visible at the time the episodes were written, extrapolated to their logical conclusion through the application of intelligence and knowledge rather than precognition. The Trump prediction is perhaps the clearest example of this. The writers did not predict Trump's presidency by seeing something no one else could see. Trump had been publicly considering and discussing a presidential run since the late 1980s, and by the time the year 2000 episode aired, he had been a fixture of tabloid American culture for well over a decade. His combination of celebrity, wealth, and outsized personality made him an obvious comedic vehicle for a joke about the direction American politics was heading. The writers looked at the trajectory and pushed it forward to its absurd conclusion. The Disney acquisition of a media competitor was not a prediction of the specific 2019 transaction. It was an observation about the accelerating trend of media consolidation and a satirical extension of that trend to its obvious endpoint. The smartwatch joke was not a vision of a specific product. It was the observation that technology was continuously becoming more personal and more integrated into the body, taken to a slightly extreme but entirely logical conclusion. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been among the most academically credentialed in American television. Multiple writers hold degrees from elite universities with strong programs in mathematics, science, computing, and political theory. These are people whose professional occupation is studying American culture, identifying the patterns in it, and then extrapolating those patterns to their most revealing and absurd conclusions. They are not predicting the future. They are reading the present with unusual care and then following its lines forward. But here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, and where the explanation of statistical probability and educated extrapolation begins to feel, if not inadequate, at least incomplete. Some of the coincidences are too specific for general trend spotting to account for them comfortably. The Trump escalator descent, depicted in the show before it happened, is not just a prediction that a celebrity might seek political office. It is a visual that matches a specific moment in a specific announcement in a way that feels like more than extrapolation. The tiger attack depicted years before a real tiger attack involving the specific performers who were referenced is not simply the observation that performing with large wild animals is dangerous. It is a specific detail that maps onto a specific event. These are not vague trend predictions. They are precise details that align with future events in ways that make you sit quietly for a moment and look at the ceiling. This is where the meta-theory enters, and it is more interesting than any version of the prophecy story. The Simpsons does not predict the future. The Simpsons shapes the future, not through magic, not through the mysterious foreknowledge of particularly gifted writers, through the mechanism of cultural influence operating at a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend from the inside. The Simpsons is one of the most watched, most quoted, most referenced, and most deeply embedded pieces of American popular culture ever produced. It has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its jokes have entered the common language. Its characters are recognizable across generations and across cultures that have never directly watched the show. Its observations about American life have become part of how Americans understand their own experience. When The Simpsons makes a joke about a celebrity becoming president, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people encounter it. It becomes a reference point. It becomes something people say in passing and remember vaguely and reach for when they see certain things in the news. The joke does not predict the future. The joke makes the future feel familiar before it arrives. It primes the cultural imagination. It makes certain ideas feel less like shocking impossibilities and more like inevitable punchlines. And when the punchline arrives, when reality catches up to the joke, the cultural response is not shock. It is recognition. We have seen this before. The show already did this. This was always going to happen. The Simpsons did not predict Disney acquiring Fox. The Simpsons made media consolidation feel so obvious and inevitable that when it actually occurred, the cultural response was a shrug and a reference to the episode. The show's satire did not forecast the outcome. It normalized it years in advance, so that when it arrived, it felt like the conclusion of an argument that everyone already understood. Springfield does not reflect America from a distance. America has been becoming Springfield. We stared into the mirror for 36 years, and we started to resemble what we saw. The nuclear power plant, the corrupt billionaire, the incompetent government, the population too distracted by immediate pleasures to notice the structural damage being done to the systems around them, the endless cycle of catastrophe and reset, the collective amnesia that permits the same mistakes to be made repeatedly without consequence, because consequences require memory, and memory requires attention. And attention is the one resource that Springfield and America can never quite sustain. Springfield was not a prediction of where America was heading. Springfield was a description of where America already was. The writers just put it on paper first. And here is the final piece that makes the prediction phenomenon genuinely strange, even accounting for everything we have discussed. The Simpsons has also made jokes that did not come true. Many of them, jokes about jetpacks becoming commonplace, about moon colonies, about technologies that never materialized, about political outcomes that went the other way, about cultural shifts that simply did not occur. Nobody screenshots those. Nobody builds social media posts around them. Nobody writes articles documenting the predictions that failed, because a failed prediction is not interesting in the way that a successful one is. Confirmation bias operates in one direction only. We remember the hits, we ignore the misses. And when you filter 800 episodes of content through that selective memory, you end up with a highlight reel that looks exactly like prophecy. The predictions are not supernatural. They are not conspiratorial. They are the natural output of a brilliantly written show running for an impossibly long time, staffed by highly educated observers of American culture who produce more satirical content per year than any other show in television history, filtered through the most powerful confirmation bias engine ever created. The Simpsons wrote enough possible futures that some of them were bound to arrive, and the ones that arrived are the only ones anyone remembers. But even knowing how the mechanism works, even understanding the statistics and the selection bias and the cultural priming, it is still striking to watch a clip from 1997 line up against a headline from this week. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of observations about the direction of American life, and enough of them correct, or close enough to correct, that even the people who made the show occasionally pause and wonder whether they know something they should not. That pause is the most honest moment in the conversation. The show's own creators, who understand better than anyone how the mechanism works, still feel it. And that, more than any individual prediction, is the strangest thing of all. Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More people can identify it by name than can name the capital of roughly half the actual states in the country. It has a nuclear power plant, a tire fire that has been burning for as long as anyone can remember, a gorge with a specific history, a harbor, a monorail system of questionable safety, an elementary school, a prison, multiple hospitals, and a convenience store that serves as the informal center of social gravity for an entire community. It has mountains, it has an ocean, it has desert, it has dense forest, it has farmland. Depending on which episode you are watching, it is located near the Canadian border, or near the Mexican border, or somewhere in the Midwest, or on the East Coast, or in the Pacific Northwest. Springfield borders Ohio and Nevada and Maine and Kentucky in different episodes, sometimes in ways that would require it to physically occupy multiple geographic positions simultaneously. It has weather that swings from blizzard conditions to tropical heat within a single season. It has oceanfront property visible from areas that should be landlocked. It has geographic features that cannot coexist within a single location and yet coexist in Springfield without explanation or acknowledgement. The show has been deliberately contradicting itself about Springfield's location for its entire 36-year run. Every time a clue surfaces that seems to narrow the possibilities, another clue appears in a different episode that invalidates it. Every time fans develop a consensus about which state best fits the available evidence, the show produces new evidence that points somewhere else entirely. Matt Groening, the show's creator, addressed this directly in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine. He said he named the town Springfield because it is one of the most common city names in America, and because he grew up near Springfield, Oregon, which inspired the choice. For approximately 48 hours, the mystery appeared to be solved. The show is set in Oregon, Springfield is Springfield, Oregon, or at least inspired by it. And then the show continued exactly as before, placing Springfield in geographic context completely inconsistent with Oregon in episodes aired after the interview. The writers did not honor the confession. Groening spoke, and Springfield shrugged and kept moving, because the mystery was never meant to be solved. The unresolvable nature of Springfield's location is not a production oversight. It is the show's most sustained and sophisticated single joke. The punchline has been running since 1989, and it has not gotten old because the setup never ends. The surface-level explanation is one that the show's creators have confirmed explicitly. Springfield is designed to be universal. It is designed to feel like every viewer's hometown, regardless of where that viewer actually lives. It is constructed from pieces of every American community that has ever existed, assembled without regard for geographic logic, because geographic logic would root it in a specific place, and a specific place would exclude everyone who did not grow up there. Springfield has the industrial decay of the Rust Belt. It has the suburban sprawl of the Sun Belt. It has the cultural claustrophobia of small-town New England, and the cheerful blankness of the Midwest, and the mild weather and geographic variety of the Pacific Coast, all layered on top of each other in a composite that should be impossible and somehow feels exactly right to almost everyone who watches it. This is real and it is intentional. The show was designed this way. But under the lens of the theories we have been exploring, Springfield's geographic impossibility takes on dimensions that extend well beyond the production decision to make the show universally relatable. If the radiation theory is true, if Springfield is a contamination zone in which the ordinary rules of biology have been fundamentally altered by decades of nuclear exposure, then why would geography be exempt? The people of Springfield have 4 fingers on each hand and yellow skin, and they survive injuries that should be fatal. The fish have 3 eyes. A resident who is over 100 years old runs the primary employer. If biological reality is negotiable in Springfield, there is no particular reason to expect geographic reality to be more stable. Maybe Springfield has oceanfront access and mountain ranges, and desert all within driving distance because the contamination that warped its people also warped its space. Maybe the radiation has compressed geographic features that should be hundreds of miles apart into a single impossible region, the same way it has compressed normal human biology into something that operates differently from what you would find anywhere else. If the coma theory is true, Springfield's geography makes even more immediate sense. Homer's dreaming brain does not have a precise internal map of North America in its storage. It has impressions. It has fragments. It has the emotional residue of every place he ever visited or saw on television or heard described by someone at a party. Mountains from a vacation he vaguely remembers, an ocean from a commercial for something he watched on television once, desert from a film he saw at some point, farmland from a drive he took through the middle of the country that he no longer clearly recollects. The dreaming brain does not organize geography with cartographic precision. It organizes with emotional logic, which is to say it places things where they feel right rather than where they actually are. Homer's mind assembled Springfield from every American landscape he ever encountered, layering them without concern for physical coherence. Because coherence is not what the dream needs. The dream needs familiarity. The dream needs the feeling of America, not its accurate dimensions. And if the principle and the pauper is the key, if Springfield's collective denial and its systematic suppression of inconvenient truths explains the town's behavior, then the geographic ambiguity serves a function that is specifically protective. You cannot investigate a town you cannot find. You cannot bring regulatory action against a nuclear facility if the state it operates in keeps changing. You cannot establish jurisdiction over a contamination event if the contaminated area refuses to submit to any consistent regulatory authority. The Environmental Protection Agency in the film is able to dome the town, but even the dome cannot contain Springfield indefinitely, because Springfield is not subject to the ordinary constraints that would apply to a real location in a real state. Springfield floats between jurisdictions because floating is safer than landing. Landing means a fixed regulatory authority, a consistent state attorney general, a permanent congressional district represented by someone who could, theoretically, be held accountable for what happens inside it. Accountability requires location. Location requires commitment to a place. And Springfield has never committed to a place. The episode Behind the Laughter took this instability and made it explicit. In the original broadcast of that episode, a mockumentary framing device identified the Simpson family as being from northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns, the location was changed to a different state. The answer to where Springfield is literally depends on which version of the episode you are watching, and the show acknowledged this without appearing to find it troubling. Springfield gave you the truth and then changed the truth. The answer was provided and then replaced. Even the definitive answer is not definitive. It shifts. It mutates. It refuses to stay where it was placed. Every state in the country has been put forward by fans as Springfield's probable location at some point. Every theory has evidence supporting it. Every theory has evidence that undermines it. The show has deliberately created this state of perpetual ambiguity and has maintained it across 3.5 decades with impressive consistency. Springfield will never be located, not because the writers have not decided among themselves, though they may not have, but because Springfield is more valuable as a mystery than as an answer. A town that could be anywhere belongs to everyone. And a town that belongs to everyone is a town that nobody can regulate, nobody can audit, nobody can shut down. The geographic impossibility of Springfield is the same kind of protection as the collective amnesia of its population. It is a defense mechanism built into the structure of the show itself, rendering the most dangerous fictional town in American history permanently beyond the reach of any authority that might want to ask it questions. Springfield does not exist in any state. Springfield exists in all of them. And wherever it is, the cooling towers are still cracking, and the water is still wrong, and the fish still have 3 eyes, and nobody is asking why. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons first aired in December of 1989. He is 10 years old right now, in whatever the current year is when you are watching this. Lisa was 8 when the show began. She is 8 now. Maggie was 1 year old. She is still 1. Homer and Marge were roughly in their mid-30s at the start of the series. They remain there, unchanged, in the same house, on the same street, in the same Springfield. 36 years have passed in the real world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. The industry term for this narrative structure is a floating timeline. It means the show's present is always the viewer's present. When an episode airs in the current year, the characters are living in the current year. Their references are current. Their technology is current. The cultural landscape around them reflects the world as it is right now. But the characters themselves do not age. The family does not change. The dynamic is preserved. The structure holds. This is a standard approach for long-running animated series. Many shows use it. Most audiences accept it without friction because the convention is understood. The same way we understand that a stage play does not require realistic geographic distances between its scenes. We accept the convention as part of the format. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has generated contradictions of a scale and a nature that go beyond what any other show has had to manage. Because the show is not just old. It is the oldest. And the floating timeline does not just create some continuity wrinkles. It creates a situation in which the characters' personal histories have had to be entirely rewritten, multiple times, to maintain the appearance of a permanent present. The most visible example is Homer and Marge's origin story. When the show began, their shared history was anchored in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school. They fell in love. They navigated the early years of their relationship against the backdrop of a specific cultural era, with its specific music and fashion and reference points. Homer's hair in those flashback episodes, Marge's prom dress, the cultural markers of their courtship, all of it was consistent with two people who were teenagers in approximately 1978. This made sense when the show started. Parents in their mid-30s in 1989 would have been teenagers in the late 1970s. The math worked. But the floating timeline dragged the present forward. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in the current year, then they were not teenagers in 1978. They were teenagers in approximately 2005, which means their high school experience was not shaped by Watergate and disco. It was shaped by early social media and whatever music was popular in the mid-2000s. The show has addressed this honestly, in its way. In later seasons, flashback episodes depicting Homer and Marge's youth were updated to include references consistent with a later decade. Their courtship has been retold with 90s cultural references, then 2000s references, then references consistent with an even more recent period. Each retelling places their formative years in a different decade while keeping the emotional core of the story. The love, the courtship, the specific dynamic between them, intact. The characters are the same, the love story is the same, but the era keeps moving forward, because it has to, because the floating timeline demands it. This means Homer and Marge do not have a fixed past. Their personal histories are drafts that get revised every several years to maintain the appearance of a present that is always current. Their memories are unstable in a structural sense. Their origin story is not a settled account of events, but a living document that the show amends as needed. Apply every theory we have discussed to this single observation. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who went unconscious in 1993. The characters are locked at the ages they were when Homer last saw them. Of course, their histories keep shifting. A dreaming brain does not have stable memories of the time before it went to sleep. It has impressions and fragments that it reassembles differently depending on what the current dream requires. Homer's unconscious mind does not have a fixed record of his courtship with Marge in the late 1970s. It has the feeling of that courtship, the emotional content of it, and it reconstructs the details to fit whatever the current dream needs them to be. The radiation theory says the character's biology has been altered enough by long-term contamination to affect not just physical aging, but the neurological mechanisms by which time is perceived and memory is maintained. In a population whose hippocampi have been damaged by decades of environmental contamination, memory formation is unreliable. Events are stored imprecisely. Personal histories are reconstructed rather than recalled. The past is whatever the brain can piece together from fragments, which means it is unstable and subject to revision each time it is accessed. The collective denial theory from the Principal and the Pauper suggests that the floating timeline is simply the macro-level expression of what Springfield does at every scale. The town forgets, deliberately and collectively, whatever would require it to confront something uncomfortable. Acknowledging that Homer and Marge are the ages they are but met in the year they apparently met would require acknowledging that time has passed. And acknowledging that time has passed would require acknowledging everything that time carries with it, the aging of their children, the expiration of the life they are living, the fact that the kids should be adults by now, and the house should be different, and the family should have evolved into something that the show is not prepared to become. Springfield forgets the timeline because remembering it would end the show. And the town of Springfield is committed, above all other things, to not ending. The Burns immortality theory contributes something specific here. If at least one resident of Springfield has found a way to extend his life indefinitely through technology and resources, then the concept of aging is already understood within this universe to be negotiable rather than fixed. Burns has been alive for over a century. His continued existence proves that the normal relationship between time and biological degradation can be disrupted if you have sufficient access to the right tools. If aging is optional for the most powerful person in town, is it entirely surprising that the town's other residents seem to have found their own, less intentional version of the same exemption? And the prediction theory adds its own layer. The Simpsons exists in a feedback loop with American culture in which the show and its cultural context mirror each other so closely that the distinction between the show's internal time and external reality has become porous. The show ages with America while its characters do not. It makes the present feel familiar by having always already been there. The floating timeline is not a production convenience, but an expression of the show's fundamental relationship with time, which is to exist everywhere in it simultaneously. The show has imagined its characters growing up. It has done this in flash-forward episodes and in elaborate future-set stories. In Season 6, the episode Lisa's Wedding depicted Lisa as a 23-year-old woman, engaged to be married, living a life shaped by the person the show had always suggested she would become. The episode is detailed and emotionally rich, and genuinely moving as a piece of storytelling about what it means to love your family while also becoming someone separate from them. That future Lisa is articulate about the tension between who she is and where she came from. She has grown into her intelligence without growing out of her heart. She is lonely in some of the ways the show always suggested she would be lonely, and she is loved in some of the ways she always needed to be loved. The episode proves, definitively and without ambiguity, that The Simpsons can imagine its characters as adults. The writers know what these people would become if time were allowed to pass. They choose not to let it. The flash forward is a single episode, one window, briefly opened and then closed. Lisa returns to being 8 years old. Bart returns to being 10. The future is locked away in the episode's credits, and the permanent present resumes as if the glimpse never happened. The show can imagine the arc and refuses to follow it. This is the statement the show makes about itself, and it is the most honest thing it has ever done. It is not a statement about animation or production logistics or the commercial requirements of long-running television. It is a statement about what the show is and what it represents in American culture, and what would happen if it were allowed to follow its characters to their natural conclusion. The Simpsons is the American family. They have been the American family for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium. And the American family, as The Simpsons depicts it, is not allowed to change. Homer must remain the working father who fails upward. Marge must remain the patient mother who holds everything together. Bart must remain the rebel who never quite crosses into irredeemability. Lisa must remain the idealist who has not yet been broken. Maggie must remain the baby who has not yet spoken. The structure must be preserved, not because the writers cannot imagine something different, but because the something different would mean the end of the structure. The moment Bart turns 11, the question arises of when he will be 12. The moment Lisa moves to college, the question arises of what happens to the house. The moment Maggie begins talking in complete sentences, the mystery at the center of her character resolves, and she becomes a different character. The moment Homer retires, the power plant storyline ends. The moment Marge has an empty nest, the show is about something different from what it has always been about. Aging is the enemy of the show's premise, not because the premise cannot accommodate older characters, but because allowing the characters to age would mean admitting that the version of America the show represents, the chaotic and resilient and eternally optimistic middle-class American family, was always temporary, that it had a beginning and would have an end, that the kids were always going to grow up and the house was always going to change and the family was always going to evolve into something different from what it was. America does not want that story. Not from this show. America wants Bart at 10 and Lisa at 8 and Homer stumbling through the door on a Friday night and the beer cold and the game on and the family on the couch exactly as they have always been. The floating timeline is the show's thesis statement. These characters are frozen in time because we need them to be, because they represent something we cannot bring ourselves to release. And every week, when the theme plays and the family slides into their seats on the couch, we press pause on 36 years of changes in our own lives, and we go home. To a house that hasn't changed. On a street that hasn't changed. In a town that cannot be located and will not be aged and refuses to end. And maybe that is the show's final and most complete theory of itself. The Simpsons is not a story about a family, it is a place. A place where nothing changes, because the thing we need most from it is the certainty that it will still be there when we come back. The loop is not their prison, it is ours. We built it, we maintain it, we tune in every week to make sure the walls are still standing. And the walls are always still standing. There are two characters in The Simpsons who have never been at the center of the show's attention, and whose significance is almost entirely visible in what happens around them, rather than to them. One of them is the most frequently killed character in the history of American animation. The other is the most consistently punished good person the show has ever depicted. Neither of them is the main character. Neither of them is meant to be. And that, as it turns out, is precisely the point. Hans Moleman does not receive much introduction when he first appears in the show's background. He simply materializes in various scenes, a small and ancient-looking man with impaired vision, moving through Springfield at the margins of whatever else is happening. He is there, he exists, and things happen to him. Things like being hit by vehicles moving at speed, being crushed under falling objects, being buried alive in various contexts and by various means, being incinerated, being eaten by animals that should not be in the positions in which they find him, being struck by lightning, being involved in accidents of such regularity and variety that the sheer breadth of the catalog begins to feel less like a running gag and more like a specific statement about the universe's relationship to Hans Moleman. He dies. The show has killed him dozens of times. Not in dream sequences, not in Treehouse of Horror episodes that exist outside the main continuity, in regular canonical episodes as part of the actual documented history of Springfield. Hans Moleman dies, and then he appears in the next episode. No resurrection. No explanation of how he returned. He simply comes back ready to be killed again, in an endless cycle that the show treats as background noise because Springfield has decided that this too is simply how things are around here. Most viewers accept this as a running gag. Molman is a joke about how the show treats minor characters. He exists to die. It is funny. Move on. But there is one piece of information about Hans Molman that the show provides, and almost no one takes seriously, because it would require accepting something that is genuinely difficult to integrate into any coherent understanding of Springfield. Molman has stated his age as 31 years old. 31? Look at him. Hans Molman presents visually as a man in his 80s or 90s at the very least. His skin is deeply lined. His posture is severely compromised. His eyesight has deteriorated to the point where he requires thick corrective lenses and still appears to see very little. His voice, his movement, his entire physical presentation suggests someone in the final years of a very long life. He is, according to his own stated age, 31 years old. If he is telling the truth, and there is nothing within the show's logic to suggest he is lying, something happened to Hans Molman that aged him catastrophically. Something took a man who was somewhere in his mid-20s, young, presumably physically normal, presumably not the tiny hunched figure he has become, and transformed him into what we see now. And then, after performing this transformation on him, that same something made him essentially unkillable. He dies repeatedly and returns repeatedly, in a cycle that the show presents as inevitable. He is ancient looking at 31, and he cannot die despite repeated and often spectacular attempts by the universe to finish him off. Under the radiation theory, Molman represents the most extreme mutation in Springfield. A man whose body has been so thoroughly altered by the power plant's discharge that the normal relationship between biological age and calendar age has been completely severed. The radiation aged him outwardly while simultaneously altering his cellular biology enough to make death a reversible condition rather than a final one. He looks 90 because his cells are aging at an impossible rate. He keeps coming back because his biology has developed a regenerative capacity that no ordinary human body possesses. He does not survive his deaths the way Homer survives injury. Homer endures damage and heals. Molman actually dies. His body ceases to function in whatever way it ceases to function that week, and then he reconstitutes. Death in Springfield for Molman is not an exit. It is a temporary condition, a brief interruption in the continuity of his existence, after which everything resumes more or less as before. Under the coma theory, Molman is something sadder. He is a background process in Homer's dream, a character too minor for Homer's unconscious mind to maintain with any consistency. He exists to populate scenes, to make Springfield feel inhabited, and when the dream no longer needs him for a given episode, he lapses. He dies, in the narrative sense, because Homer's dreaming brain stops sustaining him. And he returns because the next scene needs someone to be crushed by something in the background, and Molman is the available figure. He is not a person in this reading. He is furniture, a prop that the dream breaks and then reassembles because the dream needs a certain number of bodies to maintain the texture of a populated town. Under the collective denial theory, Molman's deaths are simply another thing Springfield has agreed not to notice. He dies in public, in front of witnesses, and nobody investigates. Nobody asks how he keeps returning. The town has normalized his death cycle the same way it has normalized the three-eyed fish and the glowing employer and the baby who may or may not have shot someone. This is simply how things are in Springfield. Molman dies sometimes, and then he is back, and nobody needs to discuss it further. The most honest reading of Hans Molman is that he is Springfield's most visible illustration of what the radiation theory predicts about the town's population. He is what happens when the contamination takes maximum effect on a single organism. Premature aging so extreme it looks like geriatric collapse at 31. Resilience so extreme that death becomes impermanent. The trade-off between those two outcomes visible in a single person, walking through Springfield's background, getting hit by things, coming back, and never once asking why this keeps happening to him. Because asking why is not something Springfield does. Now we need to talk about Ned Flanders. Ned Flanders is, on the surface, everything Homer Simpson is not. He is physically healthy, he is financially responsible, he is genuinely kind, generous with his time and his resources to a degree that goes well beyond social obligation. He is devoutly religious, and his faith appears sincere rather than performative. He is a good father to his sons. He is a good neighbor to Homer, despite Homer's consistent failure to be a good neighbor in return. By any objective measure that a reasonable person might apply, Ned Flanders is a better person than Homer Simpson in essentially every way that can be assessed. He tries harder, he succeeds more consistently, he causes significantly less harm to the people around him. And the show punishes him for it, continuously and without apparent end. His wife Maude was killed by a freak accident at the Springfield Speedway. The mechanism of her death was this. Homer was dodging t-shirt cannons at a racing event, leaping out of the way of each shirt as it was fired. The shirts he avoided hit Maude instead. She fell from the bleachers. She died. Homer's reflexive selfishness, his instinct to protect himself from even minor inconvenience, directly caused the death of his neighbor's wife. Ned forgave him, because that is what Ned does. He forgives, he absorbs punishment, and responds with grace. He turns the other cheek with a consistency that, over the course of years of watching, begins to feel less like virtue and more like a compulsion. The show eventually explains why. In a Season 8 episode, after a hurricane destroys Ned's house, and the community rebuilds it so poorly that it collapses immediately, Ned breaks. He has a complete psychological collapse, in public, in front of the people who rebuilt the house badly, and in front of Homer, and in front of the town. He screams. He insults everyone who has ever wronged him with a directness and a specificity that suggests he has been cataloging these grievances for a long time. He says things he has been holding behind his relentless cheerfulness for years. And then he is committed to a mental health facility, where it is revealed that Ned's positivity is not natural. It is not a character trait that emerged organically from his values or his faith or his upbringing. It is the result of childhood behavioral modification. Ned was, as a young child, violent and essentially unmanageable. His parents, being committed to a philosophical position that rejected discipline and authority, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him. The treatment worked. The rage was suppressed. The kindness that remained was not the absence of the rage, but its management. Ned Flanders's fundamental goodness is not who he is. It is a cage built around who he used to be. This changes everything about how the show reads. His patience with Homer is not saintly tolerance. It is pathological compliance, the behavioral output of a nervous system that was conditioned in childhood to suppress anger at any cost, regardless of the provocation. He cannot allow himself to express the rage that is clearly present in him, because his entire psychological architecture was built to prevent exactly that expression. His forgiveness of Homer after Maude's death is not an act of grace. It is the programmed response of a man who has no access to the anger that would be a natural and human response to what Homer's behavior cost him. His faith, which the show depicts as central to his identity, reads differently in this context too. A man who has had his emotional responses systematically suppressed, who has been conditioned to channel negative experience into acceptance and positive expression, for whom the only available framework for understanding suffering is the theological one that converts it into something meaningful that man would find in religion not just comfort but structural necessity. His faith is not a luxury. It is the load-bearing wall of his psychology. Without it, without the framework that tells him his suffering is meaningful and his patience is rewarded and his losses are part of a plan, the entire edifice of his constructed goodness would have nothing to rest against. And the show provides one final detail that, once you have absorbed it, cannot be unforgotten. God talks to Homer. Multiple times. Direct, personal conversation, depicted as literal fact within the show's universe. Homer receives divine communication as a matter of course. God tells Homer things. God gives Homer insight and comfort, and the occasional direct intervention in his problems. God has never spoken to Ned Flanders. Not once, across 36 years of episodes. Homer Simpson, who sleeps through church when he goes at all, who treats religion as vague cultural background noise, who has no particular spiritual discipline or commitment, receives direct divine conversation. Ned Flanders, who has organized his entire life around his faith, who attends services without fail, who structures his parenting and his relationships and his understanding of the world through a sincere and practiced religious commitment, gets silence. The drunk who falls asleep in the pew gets God's attention. The devout man who has given his whole life to seeking it gets nothing. The show is not making a random choice here. It is making a specific and uncomfortable argument. In Springfield, goodness is not rewarded. Effort is not compensated. The careful and considered life does not receive more consideration than the careless one. The system that governs Springfield, whether that system is Burns's economic dominance, or the radiation's cognitive effects, or Homer's coma dream, or the collective social contract of denial, does not distribute outcomes based on merit or virtue or sincere effort. It distributes outcomes based on other criteria entirely: compliance, usefulness, proximity to the center of power. Homer is at the center of the dream, if the coma theory is true, which means reality bends toward his comfort. Homer is the safety inspector whose incompetence serves Burns's interests, which means the system protects him. Homer is the dreamer, which means the universe arranges itself around his needs even when those needs involve surviving things that should not be survivable. Ned is useful to Homer as a contrast, as the good neighbor who makes Homer's failings visible by existing immediately adjacent to them. And being useful to Homer as a contrast is not the same as being protected by whatever force protects Homer. Ned suffers because his suffering makes the narrative point that the show needs made, and he endures the suffering with the grace of a man who has no other available response. That is the darkest thing the show has ever done to a character. Not the deaths, not the physical comedy, not even the loss of Maud. The darkest thing is that Ned Flanders has spent 36 years being the best person in Springfield, and the universe has noticed and said nothing back to him, while turning its attention repeatedly and warmly to the man next door, who tries the least and succeeds the most. Homer and Ned have lived next door to each other since the show began. The gap between them, between the man who tries every day and the man who often does not, has never once closed. Because the gap is the point. Springfield is not a town where virtue creates advantage. Springfield is a town where the system rewards exactly the behaviors that serve the system's continued operation. Homer's incompetence serves Burns. Homer's compliance serves the plant. Homer's damaged cognition serves everyone who benefits from a population that cannot connect the observable evidence of its own exploitation to the source of that exploitation. Ned's virtue serves no one's interests except his own. And in Springfield, interests that do not serve the system do not receive the system's support. Molman dies and comes back. Ned endures and stays. And both of them will be there next week, exactly as they are now, unchanged, unresolved, waiting in the background of a story that will never quite decide what to do with them. That is also Springfield. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. Let's take a breath and think about what we have actually been looking at across everything we have covered. We started with the power plant and the physical evidence that it has been contaminating an entire town for 36 years. We followed that evidence through the mutations in the residents, the three-eyed fish, the anomalies in the animals, the specific ways that every family in Springfield presents physical characteristics that do not appear in normal human populations outside their town. We went deeper and found that this contamination has a human architect, a man who benefits from it, who depends on it personally for his own survival, who has spent over a century building a system designed to ensure that the contamination continues and that no one in the town is cognitively capable of demanding it stop. We proposed a different theory, one that does not contradict the radiation theory but layers on top of it, in which the entire Springfield we have been watching is the dream of a man who has not been conscious since the spring of 1993. We trace the evidence for this through the tonal shift after the coma episode, through the impossibility of the aging freeze, through the God conversation that preceded the coma like a warning, through the show's own oblique acknowledgement of the theory in a season 34 episode that animated Homer waking up and then told you it was a joke. We reopened the shooting case and found that the official answer, the one the show has committed to and the writers stand behind, does not account for the clue that Burns himself described as meaningless, does not explain how Burns would recognize Maggie with the specific familiarity of someone known to him, does not address Homer's unexamined confession 18 seasons later, and does not explain why the contest that was supposedly designed around a solvable mystery produced essentially no correct answers. We examined the man who has stayed alive for over a century through a combination of extreme medical intervention, personal wealth operating at a scale that makes institutional accountability theoretical, and a system of mutual dependency with the town he is poisoning that makes his death economically catastrophic for the very population he is harming. We found Maggie in the silence where nobody was looking, and we recognized in that silence not developmental delay but strategy. Not absence of intelligence, but the intelligent concealment of intelligence by a person who has observed that revealing intelligence in Springfield is a reliable path to being ignored or punished. We followed Mona Simpson underground and traced the damage her forced exile caused across 3 generations of her family, and we found that the man who drove her out is the same man who employed her son for his entire adult life without ever learning his name, who signed the paychecks that sustained the family of the woman he had ruined, who built an empire in part on the psychological damage done to one child who grew up believing his mother left because she did not want him. We watched Springfield vote to exile the truth and legalize the lie, and we recognized in that vote not a failed episode but an honest description of how the town has always operated, presented without its usual off-screen discretion. We counted the predictions and found that the mechanism behind them is less supernatural than it is a reflection of how deeply the show has embedded itself in American culture, not predicting the future but normalizing it, not seeing ahead but being seen so widely and absorbed so thoroughly that it shapes the cultural imagination that then produces the futures it depicted. We looked for Springfield on a map and found it everywhere, which means it is nowhere, which is precisely the point. We traced the floating timeline back through every theory until we arrived at the same conclusion from multiple directions. Time does not work in Springfield because something, the radiation or the coma, or the collective will of a population that has decided not to notice it, has broken the normal operation of temporal reality for everyone who lives there. And we found Hans Moleman dying at 31, and we found Ned Flanders enduring everything the universe could send at him while God paid exclusive attention to his neighbor, and we recognized in both of them the same thing we have been finding at every level of this investigation. Springfield is not a quirky town with unusual residents. Springfield is a system, a closed, self-sustaining, self-reinforcing system in which every element exists to maintain the operation of every other element, and in which the human beings who live inside it have been shaped, deliberately or accidentally, into precisely the kinds of people a system like this requires to keep running. It needs someone like Homer in Sector 7G, compliant, damaged enough not to ask questions, grateful enough for the stability of a job not to risk losing it by noticing things, present enough to nominally fulfill the safety inspection function while actually ensuring that the violations continue. It needs someone like Ned next door, good enough to make Homer's failures visible, enduring enough to demonstrate what the system does to people who try to do everything right without understanding the rules the system actually runs on, compliant enough, through his conditioning, to never become a genuine threat. It needs Burns at the top, ancient, resourceful, intelligent enough to understand what he is doing and callous enough not to be troubled by it, dependent on the infrastructure he has built in ways that make his interests and the infrastructure's interests identical, too expensive to die. And it needs Springfield itself, the town that cannot be located, that cannot remember its own history, that votes to exile truth and criminalize memory, that exists in a permanent present tense in which every catastrophe is forgotten and every reset is accepted and every question that might destabilize the system goes unasked. Every theory we have explored tonight is a different language for the same observation. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something structural and fundamental and durable. And the show has been telling you about it since the first episode in 1989, not through dramatic exposition, not through a character who breaks the fourth wall and explains the situation directly, but through accumulation, through detail laid on top of detail across 36 years and nearly 800 episodes, until the picture is so complete and so coherent that the only explanation for not seeing it is that you were not looking, or that something was preventing you from looking, which is, of course, the radiation theory's final and most unsettling implication. The audience, watching Springfield, consuming its content, absorbing its references, making its jokes part of their own language and their own way of understanding American life, is doing something that looks a lot like what the residents of Springfield do when they see the glowing figure in the forest and reach for extraterrestrial explanations. We see the evidence, we process the information, and then we accept the surface explanation because accepting the deeper one would require confronting something we are not prepared to confront. Springfield is everywhere. Springfield is every town. Springfield is the version of America that exists when the institutions designed to protect people from the systems that exploit them have been made irrelevant, either through corruption or through the cognitive damage that comes from living inside a contaminated environment for long enough that you can no longer imagine it being different. The show has been running for 36 years because we have not been ready to stop watching. Because Bart is still 10 and Lisa is still 8 and Maggie still has not spoken and Homer still comes home every Friday night and the house on Evergreen Terrace is still there, unchanged, exactly as it has always been. And that is not a small thing. That is the most honest thing the show has ever offered. The thing it has been offering every Sunday night for 36 years, beneath all the jokes and the theories and the mysteries and the evidence and the questions that Springfield cannot ask because Springfield cannot afford to ask them. The thing it is offering you right now, in this moment, as you lie somewhere comfortable with the darkness around you and the night quiet and the world at some appropriate distance. A family that does not change, a town that does not age, a story that does not end. Not because the story has nothing more to say, but because it refuses to say goodbye. Homer Simpson has been dreaming since 1993, if the coma theory is true. And every episode you have ever watched of this show, every strangling and every donut and every couch gag and every reset, has been an unconscious man holding his family in his mind as carefully as he can, preserving them at the exact moment he loved them most, because letting go of them would mean waking up into a world where they have changed without him. His children are still young. His wife still waits for him. The house is still warm. The beer is still cold. The story is still going. That is not laziness. That is not a failure of imagination. That is a man who loves his family more than he loves the truth, holding them in the only place left to him. Inside a dream that he built. Inside a town that cannot be located. Inside a loop that never breaks because he will not let it break because the day it breaks is the day he has to find out what it cost him. Every episode you watched was a love letter. Every reset was a refusal. Every time the credits rolled, and the family was intact, and Evergreen Terrace was quiet, and the cooling towers were cracking, and the fish had 3 eyes, and nobody was asking why, it was Homer's brain saying, "Not yet. Not yet. Let me stay here a little longer." And we stayed with him. All of us. For 36 years. Because he is us, and Marge is someone we love, and Bart is who we wanted to be, and Lisa is who we should have been, and Maggie is the part of ourselves we keep hidden, watching everything, saying nothing, waiting. And because the couch we sat on when we first watched the opening credits is gone now, or in someone else's house, or something we only half remember. And as long as The Simpsons is on, as long as the loop holds, as long as the theme plays and the family assembles on the couch and Homer's name appears in the title sequence, we do not have to admit that. We can go home, to Evergreen Terrace, to Springfield, to the family that never changes, in the town convert ages, in the show that will be there whenever we need it, and the cooling towers will still be cracking, and the water will still be wrong, and the fish will still have 3 eyes, and nobody will be asking why. And that, after 4 hours, is okay. There is one annual corner of the Simpsons universe that operates under different rules from everything else, and it deserves its own space in this conversation because of what it reveals about the show's relationship with its own darkness. Every October, for 35 years, The Simpsons has produced a Treehouse of Horror episode, a Halloween special, in 3 parts, in which the normal constraints of the show are suspended. Characters die and stay dead. Monsters are real. Horror is genuine rather than comedic. The show allows itself, once per year, to go to places it cannot go in its regular episodes, and what it chooses to do with that freedom is revealing. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are not simply horror parodies. They are not just the show dressing its characters in genre costumes for the holiday. The best of them use the freedom of the non-canonical space to tell stories about the regular characters that the canonical format will not permit. Stories in which Homer's failures have permanent consequences. Stories in which Bart's mischief causes actual deaths. Stories in which Lisa's intellect cannot save her from the thing that is coming. The canonical show has a reset button that erases consequences between episodes. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are the show without the reset button. They are Springfield with continuity, with stakes, with the understanding that what happens here is real even if it is only real for the duration of a single segment. And the things that happen there, the specific fears and specific anxieties and specific darkness that the show chooses to explore when the safety rails are down, are not random. They are the fears that the canonical show has been suppressing. The fears that live underneath the jokes and the gags and the weekly reset, waiting for the 1 month per year when they are allowed out. Homer's fear of being inadequate as a father, the specific terror of being the person standing between your children and the world, and knowing, in the part of yourself that is most honest, that you are not sufficient to that task. This appears in Treehouse of Horror in nightmare versions that the canonical show can only approach sideways. Lisa's fear of a world that will not hear her. the specific despair of seeing clearly what needs to be done and being surrounded by people who cannot or will not engage with what she sees. This also appears in Treehouse of Horror, in forms that the canonical show softens into a recurring arc of idealism, challenged and partially restored. Bart's fear of the consequences of his own actions. The concern, never fully articulated in canonical episodes, that the pranks and the mischief and the casual destruction might eventually cross a line from which there is no return. Treehouse of Horror takes this fear and follows it to its conclusion. And Maggie, Quiet Maggie, appears in Treehouse of Horror occasionally with a specificity that the canonical show rarely allows itself. Treehouse reveals Maggie as something to be genuinely concerned about, rather than benignly curious about. In the horror context, her intelligence and her silence are not charming mysteries, they are unsettling. The thing that sits behind her eyes in the Treehouse of Horror segments is the same thing that sits behind her eyes in canonical episodes, but without the safety of the comedic frame around it. It is more visible, more direct. The Treehouse of Horror is the show's shadow. It is where the real fears live, where the show explores what would happen if Springfield's rules did not hold, if the reset button failed, if the consequences of everything we have discussed across 4 hours of analysis were allowed to actually land on the characters who caused and experienced them. It is the version of the show that the show cannot be all year, and it comes back every October, reliably, because the fears that it addresses do not go away in the other 11 months. They are present in every canonical episode, suppressed under the comedic format. The Treehouse of Horror is the pressure valve. Without it, the show would be even stranger than it already is. There is a specific Treehouse of Horror segment that deserves attention in the context of everything we have been discussing tonight. The segment in which Springfield residents are eaten by an alien civilization that has been fattening them up for consumption. The joke of the segment is that the aliens use a book called To Serve Man as a cookbook, and Springfield initially believes it to be a philanthropic guide. The obvious reading is that it is a Twilight Zone parody. The deeper reading is that it is the radiation theory in horror costume. An outside force, concealed behind apparent benevolence, has been feeding the Springfield population something that makes them larger and more docile and more suitable for the outsider's purposes. The population accepts the feeding without question because the feeding feels like care. They do not understand what they are being prepared for until it is too late. Burns is not an alien. But the structural parallel is deliberate and the show knows it. Every time Springfield accepts whatever Burns offers without questioning what it costs them, every time the population takes the electricity and the employment and the economic stability without asking what they are being prepared to give in return, the segment is playing in the background of the story. The Treehouse of Horror is not a distraction from the show's themes. It is the themes with their masks off. And now that we have removed the masks and looked at what is underneath them for 4 hours, it is worth remembering something before we leave Springfield for the night. The show is also funny, genuinely, consistently, across decades and in ways that hold up under analysis rather than dissolving when examined too closely. The Simpsons is funny. The jokes are real. The heart is real. The warmth between these characters, flawed and damaged and mutated and possibly dreaming as they are, is real. Homer loves his family with a completeness that his limited capacity for expression cannot adequately convey, and the show finds this funny and also true. Marge's patience is inexhaustible in ways that simultaneously strain credibility and feel exactly right. Bart's affection for his family, hidden under layers of performed indifference, erupts at the moments that matter and then disappears again, exactly as it would for a real 10-year-old who had not yet learned to let himself be soft in public. Lisa's love for the people she is always intellectually outpacing is genuine and generous, and the source of most of her pain and all of her resilience. These are real characters, not real in the way that people are real, but real in the way that good fiction is real, which is that they illuminate something about being human that feels true, even when the details are yellow and four-fingered and set in a town that cannot be located on any map. The theories are real, the mysteries are real, the darkness is real, and the family is also real. Both things are true at the same time, in Springfield and in general, which is maybe the most Springfield thing about all of it. You can see the cracked cooling towers and still love the house underneath them. You can know about the contamination and still find comfort in the show. You can trace 36 years of buried evidence and unanswered questions and structural decay and still feel, When the couch gag plays and the family slides into their seats and Homer closes the garage door on the car, something that feels like home. That is the trick. That is what the show has been doing for 36 years, more skillfully and more patiently than any other piece of television ever produced. It shows you the darkness and it shows you the light, and it lets you hold both of them at once. And in that holding, it gives you something that is very difficult to find in a world that usually insists you choose. The cooling towers are cracking. The family is on the couch. Springfield is everywhere. There is one more thread worth following before we settle into the quiet. Nostalgia is not simply the feeling of missing something from the past. The word comes from Greek roots that mean, roughly, the pain of returning home. Nostalgia is the ache of wanting to go back to somewhere that may not exist anymore, or may never have existed quite the way you remember it. The Simpsons is the most effective nostalgia machine ever built, and it achieves this through a mechanism that is counterintuitive. It does not make you nostalgic for the past. It makes you nostalgic for the present, right now, in the moment you are watching it. It creates the feeling of home while you are inside the house. How does it do this? By maintaining, across 36 years, the exact same family in the exact same house, on the exact same street, with the exact same relationships and the exact same dynamic. The show has created a reference point that is more stable than almost anything else in contemporary American culture. Every other institution that people build their sense of continuity around changes. The news changes, the political landscape changes, the economy changes, friends move away, parents age, children grow up and become strangers in some small way. The things you relied on to know who you were shift under your feet, and the ground feels different. And every Sunday night, Homer comes home from work, and Bart is on the couch, and Lisa is in her room playing saxophone, and Marge is in the kitchen, and Maggie is wherever Maggie is, watching everything. And Evergreen Terrace is exactly as it was. And you know this place. You have always known this place. It has not changed since you first arrived in it, however old you were when that was. That stability is not an accident. It is not the inadvertent consequence of a show that simply never developed an interest in change. It is a deliberate design choice, maintained over 3.5 decades, in service of providing something that is genuinely difficult to find outside of fiction. The reliable home. The place that is always there, that you can always go back to, that will be exactly as you left it regardless of how long you were away or what happened to you while you were gone. This is what Homer's coma dream preserves, if the coma theory is true. It is what the radiation theory's cognitive effects produce in the town's population, if that theory is accurate. It is what the collective denial vote in The Principal and the Pauper protects, if that reading of the episode is correct. The reliable home, preserved against every threat, maintained in the face of every challenge, defended against truth itself, if truth would require it to change. We watch The Simpsons because we need somewhere that does not change. Because change is the dominant feature of every other experience we have, and the weight of it accumulates, and we need somewhere to put it down for 22 minutes. While the couch gag plays, and Homer stumbles through his life with an incompetence so complete, it functions as a kind of grace. Because watching Homer fail at everything and still come home, still be loved, still find Marge waiting and the kids still there, tells us something that we need to hear even when we cannot articulate why we need it. That it is okay. That you can fail at almost everything and still be okay. That the people who love you will still be there when you walk in the door. That the house will still be standing. That the couch will hold you. That is the show. Underneath the radiation theory and the coma theory and the missing mother and the impossible immortal and the baby with the secret intelligence and the town that cannot be located, underneath all of it, a house that holds you, a family that stays, a town that is always there when you need it to be, and the cooling towers are cracking and the water is wrong. And none of that changes the feeling of coming home, because home and wrong have never been mutually exclusive. Ask anyone who grew up in a real version of Springfield. Ask Homer. He is still there, in the hospital bed or in the dream or in Sector 7G, holding his family in whatever piece of his mind is still capable of holding anything. And the family is still there, and the house is still standing, and the loop holds, as long as we need it to, which, it turns out, is a very long time. Every theory we have explored tonight has focused, understandably, on the Simpson family itself. They are the show's center. Their house on Evergreen Terrace is the gravitational point around which everything else orbits. But Springfield is not just the Simpsons. Springfield is a community, and communities are not made by their central families. They are made by the people who exist at every level of the system, each playing a role, each occupying a position that the system requires to be occupied if it is going to function as it does. Let's spend some time with the other people of Springfield. The people who are always there, always present, always fulfilling their function within the town's closed ecosystem, and who reveal, on examination, just how thoroughly and how completely this system has shaped every life inside it. Start with Chief Clancy Wiggum. Clancy Wiggum is the chief of police in Springfield. He is responsible for the enforcement of law within the town, for the investigation of crimes, for the protection of the population from violence and fraud and corruption. He is, in the hierarchy of civic institutions, the person who stands between Springfield's residents and the systematic abuse of those residents by anyone who is powerful enough to think they can get away with it. He is also, by any objective assessment, catastrophically unsuited to this role. Wiggum is not merely incompetent in the way that a person can be incompetent while still fundamentally caring about their job. He is comprehensively, elaborately, and consistently incompetent in ways that suggest the incompetence is structural rather than personal. He does not simply fail at investigating crimes. He fails to recognize crimes as crimes. He does not merely bungle cases. He bungles them in ways that consistently and reliably protect the people who are most responsible for the town's most significant ongoing harm. Burns's 342 safety violations have never been formally investigated by Wiggum's department. The dumping of radioactive waste into the town's water supply has never resulted in criminal charges brought by the Springfield Police Department. The discovery of human skeletons in the basement of the nuclear power plant was apparently not a triggering event for any law enforcement investigation that we are made aware of. The shooting of Mr. Burns, which is the most visible criminal event in the town's documented history, was resolved through a process so sloppy and so full of procedural failures that essentially every defense attorney in the country would have had the case thrown out on preliminary motions. Wiggum's incompetence is not randomly distributed. It consistently protects the most powerful person in Springfield. Whether through deliberate arrangement or the natural operation of the town's contaminated cognitive environment, the result is the same. Burns's activities proceed without effective law enforcement interference, decade after decade, because the law enforcement infrastructure in Springfield is optimized for inaction rather than accountability. The show hints at the origin of this arrangement in the Mother Simpson episode, in which it is revealed that Wiggum's asthma was cured during the raid on Burns's biological weapons laboratory. Wiggum was the security guard at that facility. He was connected to Burns professionally before he became Springfield's chief of police. The nature of that connection, what Burns may have done for Wiggum, what Wiggum may have agreed to provide in return, is never fully articulated. But the structural outcome is visible across the entire run of the show. Springfield's police force is not a protection for the town's residents against its most powerful exploiter. It is one more piece of infrastructure that Burns's influence has shaped to serve his interests. Now consider Mayor Joe Quimby. Mayor Quimby presents himself as a public servant of the most traditional and recognizable American political variety. His voice and his manner are drawn from a specific tradition of charismatic regional political figures whose appeal rests more on energy and projection than on policy substance. He is almost certainly corrupt in ways that the show depicts with considerable frequency. He takes bribes. He redirects public resources for private benefit. He makes policy decisions that serve his donors rather than his constituents. He is, in other words, exactly the kind of elected official that a powerful corporate operator like Burns would want in a position of civic authority. Quimby is not a threat to Burns. Quimby is a tool. He provides the appearance of democratic governance, the theater of public accountability, while ensuring that the actual mechanisms of government do not inconvenience the most powerful economic actor in town. The pairing of Wiggum and Quimby creates a comprehensive system of non-governance. The police do not investigate. The mayor does not legislate against corporate misbehavior. The courts, when they appear in the show, are depicted as equally susceptible to the various pressures that a man with Burns's resources can bring to bear. Springfield has the infrastructure of a functioning democratic community. It has elections and laws and courts and police and a mayor and a variety of civic institutions. What it does not have is a democratic community in any functional sense, because all of those institutions have been shaped, gradually and persistently, to serve the interests of the one person in town whose interests are most directly opposed to those of the population. The residents vote. The elections happen. The outcomes change the names on the office doors without changing anything about the relationship between the town and the plant. This is not satire of Springfield specifically. This is satire of America, rendered in yellow and four-fingered for clarity. And the clarity is what makes it sting. Now let's look at Springfield Elementary School and what it tells us about how the next generation is being prepared. Principal Skinner, or rather Armand Tamzarian, runs a school that is chronically underfunded, physically deteriorating, and staffed by teachers who range from mildly effective to comprehensively defeated by the conditions of their employment. The school lost its entire operating budget to a brief oil strike that Burns then stole. The arts programs have been cut. The physical plant is in disrepair. The students are taught by a combination of people who genuinely care about education and have been ground down by the system, and people who have given up so thoroughly that they barely maintain the appearance of engagement with their roles. This is, again, not specific to Springfield. This is the condition of public education in a town where the primary employer has no interest in producing a population capable of questioning its practices. An educated population is a questioning population. A questioning population is a liability for Burns. A school that produces graduates who can connect observable evidence to its causes, who can engage with complex systems and understand how they work, who have the cognitive tools to recognize when they are being exploited, is a school that poses a genuine threat to the arrangement Burns has spent over a century building. The Springfield school system, chronically underfunded and permanently struggling, is not collateral damage from Burns's financial priorities. It is an outcome that serves Burns's interests as directly as Homer's employment does. The children who attend Springfield Elementary are being prepared, through the specific educational deprivation they experience, to become exactly the kind of adults that Springfield needs. People who lack the tools to examine their situation clearly, who will accept what they are given without the analytical framework to question whether what they are given is adequate, who will grow up and take jobs at the plant and raise their own children in the same contaminated environment, and never quite be able to articulate why their lives feel heavier than they should. The system reproduces itself. It was designed to, and the school is one of the mechanisms through which it reproduces. Now let's look at Apu. Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon runs the Quick E-Mart, which functions as the informal social center of Springfield in the way that general stores have always functioned in small American communities. People pass through it. Information moves through it. The rhythms of the town's daily life flow through it in ways that make Apu one of the most connected and most observant people in Springfield. He is also, in terms of the show's own logic, an outsider. He came from somewhere else. He arrived in Springfield as an adult, with a formed identity that predated his exposure to the town's environment and the town's social pressures. He sees things that lifelong residents cannot see because he has a reference point for comparison that they lack. And he stays. Despite seeing what Springfield is, despite the evidence available to a person who is processing the town with an outsider's frame of reference, Apu stays. He builds a life in Springfield. He marries, has children, becomes embedded in the community in ways that make leaving progressively harder. This is the mechanism by which Springfield holds on to people who might otherwise leave. It gives them enough to stay for. A life, relationships, children who become roots, the weight of built investment in a particular place, which makes departure feel like loss even when the place is causing harm. Apu's children were born in Springfield. They are being raised in Springfield. They are being raised in the contaminated environment, attending the underfunded school, drinking the water, breathing the air. Apu's outsider perspective, which was once his most valuable cognitive asset in terms of understanding the town, is being diluted by the accumulation of years and attachments, and the slow normalization that happens to everyone who stays in Springfield long enough. In another decade, Apu will not be seeing Springfield through an outsider's eyes anymore. He will be seeing it through the eyes of a parent who needs to believe that the place his children are growing up is good enough for them. And that belief, maintained against the evidence, is the same belief that every parent in Springfield is maintaining. Because the alternative, acknowledging what the town is doing to the children being raised in it, is unbearable. And Springfield does not allow unbearable truths to remain conscious. It routes them through the collective denial mechanism, turns them into background noise, makes them invisible through the repeated act of not mentioning them. Apu will stay, his children will grow up, and eventually they will take their place in the system that was waiting for them. Let's look at one more character before we leave the supporting cast. Sideshow Bob. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger, Jr., known as Sideshow Bob, is perhaps the most explicitly self-aware person in Springfield's history. He is educated, cultured, genuinely intelligent in ways that most Springfield residents are not. He has articulated, across decades of interactions with the Simpson family, a sophisticated critique of contemporary American culture. He despises television, not as a pose but as a considered philosophical position. He believes that mass media degrades the people who consume it. He is, in many ways, the character most capable of seeing Springfield clearly. He is also a would-be murderer who has made repeated and serious attempts to kill a 10-year-old boy. This is the show's most darkly comic observation about intelligence in Springfield. The one character with the cognitive capacity to see the town for what it is, who has the education and the perspective and the analytical tools to construct a coherent critique of the system, has directed all of that intelligence toward homicidal obsession with a child who got him sent to prison. Sideshow Bob is what Lisa would be if she were allowed to become properly enraged and completely unmoored from moral constraint. He has the vision and lacks the goodness. Lisa has the goodness and has refused the platform for the vision. Between them, Sideshow Bob and Lisa constitute the show's clearest statement about intelligence in Springfield. It is not enough to be smart, and it is not enough to be good. You need both, functioning together, and Springfield's environment has a remarkable talent for separating the two. The smart become self-destructive, the good become powerless, and the town proceeds unexamined. Burns has been doing this for over a century. He does not need to actively prevent intelligent people from threatening his position. Springfield does it for him. Through the operation of its systems and its culture and its contaminated environment, producing generation after generation of people who are either too damaged to think clearly, or too good to act effectively, or too obsessed with private grievances to channel their capacity into anything that matters. The system is self-maintaining. That is the most frightening thing about it. Burns does not have to manage it constantly. He set it in motion over a century ago, and it runs itself now. The underfunded school, the compliant police force, the bought political establishment, the contaminated water, the cognitive fog that settles over the town and prevents it from asking the questions it would need to ask, all of it perpetuates itself without requiring active management from the man who built it. Burns can spend his weekly treatment in a daze in the forest, and the system continues. He can be shot and hospitalized and near death, and the system continues. He can be absent, preoccupied, unaware of what is happening in any given corner of Springfield, and the system continues, because the system no longer needs him to run it. It runs on inertia, on the accumulated weight of all the decisions that were made to build it, all the arrangements that were struck to sustain it, all the cognitive damage that was done to the population that lives inside it, all the institutional corruption that was allowed to calcify into the normal operating mode of Springfield's civic life. Burns built something that outlasts him, something that would continue even if he died tomorrow, something that has so thoroughly shaped the environment and the population and the institutions of Springfield that the town would maintain itself in its current form without any active intervention by the person who designed it. That is not a cartoon villain's scheme. That is how power actually works when it has had long enough to operate without accountability. Springfield is the most honest description of that process ever put on television. The Simpsons is, in its bones, a show about the American dream, not in a celebratory sense, not as a tribute, but as an examination, an autopsy, almost, of what the dream looks like from the inside when it is being lived by people who were promised it would work differently from the way it is actually working. Homer Simpson is the specific American the dream was designed for. He is a white man, he has a job, he owns his home, he has a wife who loves him, and children who, despite everything, love him too. He has a neighbor with a slightly nicer house and a slightly newer car, and he is envious of the neighbor in the specific low-grade way that American culture is designed to produce in people who have almost enough but not quite. He has health insurance through his employer. He has a stable income. He is not rich, but he is not poor. He occupies exactly the position that post-war American prosperity theory promised to the working man who showed up and did his job. And he is miserable, not in a way he can articulate, not in a way that rises to conscious awareness and produces insight or change. He is miserable in the diffuse, constant way that the show expresses through his relationship with food and television and the specific quality of his laughter, which sometimes sounds like a man laughing because it is better than whatever else he would be doing with the feeling that just surfaced. The show does not present this as Homer's personal failure. It does not suggest that a smarter or more ambitious or more spiritually sophisticated Homer would find his life fulfilling. The show presents Homer's specific brand of mild and unexamined despair as the natural output of the specific circumstances he inhabits. He does everything the dream asked him to do. He got the job, he kept the job, he bought the house, he made the family. And the job is at a nuclear power plant with 342 safety violations, run by a man who cannot remember his name. And the house sits in a town that cannot be located on any map and whose water supply has been contaminated for decades. And the family is beautiful and real and intact, and also everything Burns did to shape it before Homer was old enough to understand what was being done is present in it, invisible but structural, the way the damage from an old flood is still in the walls years after the water receded. The American dream promised Homer Simpson something. And Springfield delivered a version of it that is technically compliant with the promise's terms and completely hollow at its core. And Homer lives inside the hollow version with the specific kind of contentment that comes from never being allowed to see clearly enough to know what you are missing. The radiation does some of this work. The crayon does some of this work. The conditional job security brokered by his grandfather does some of this work. The absence of his mother does some of this work. But the show is not simply about Homer. It is about the 10 or 15 million viewers who watch Homer every week and feel something when he comes home, who feel something when he is loved despite his failures, who feel something when he puts his arm around Marge and the music swells and the episode ends. They feel something because Homer is not just a character. He is an argument about what the American working class was promised and what it was actually given, and how the gap between those two things feels when you are living in it. The dream said, show up, work hard, and you will have enough. You will have a house and a family and the stability to build something. You will not be rich, but you will be okay. You will have the dignity of work and the comfort of provision. Homer has the house and the family and the job. He does not have the dignity. He barely has the comfort. He has the material inventory of the dream without the experiential content it was supposed to contain. And Springfield reflects this. The town has the infrastructure of a healthy community. Schools, hospitals, police, civic institutions. It does not have any of those institutions functioning in the way they were supposed to function, because each of them has been shaped by the accumulated weight of Burns's century-long project of institutional capture. The dream is present. The dream is visible. The dream is in the shape of the town, and the color of the houses, and the fact that people have jobs to go to and families to go home to. And underneath the dream, the water is wrong, and the fish have 3 eyes, and the children are born yellow, and nobody is asking why. That is the show's argument. Not that the dream was false from the beginning, that it was real enough to matter, real enough that people built their lives inside it, and that what was done to the dream from inside the institutions that were supposed to sustain it was the specific and preventable betrayal of something that was genuinely worth having. Homer did everything right. Springfield did everything Burns needed it to do. And the gap between those two things is the entire show. 36 years, 800 episodes, the most analyzed piece of television ever made. And the argument has not changed since the first episode. Springfield is America with the curtain pulled back just far enough that you can see the machinery, not far enough that you have to act on what you see. Just far enough that the next time you cannot explain why your life feels heavier than the promise said it would, you remember the cracked cooling towers on the horizon and the man who cannot remember your name signing the checks that keep the house. And you laugh. Because Homer laughs. Because laughing is what you do when the alternative is understanding completely. There is a specific kind of story that The Simpsons tells better than almost any other piece of television, and it does it almost by accident, in the spaces between the jokes, in the moments when the show lets the room get quiet for just a second before the next gag lands. It tells stories about grief, about loss, about the specific weight of things that cannot be fixed or recovered or replaced. Homer's grief about his mother is the most sustained example. The show gives him 27 years of not knowing why he feels the specific emptiness that he feels. 27 years of carrying a wound whose origin he cannot identify, because the wound was created when he was 6 years old and told a lie simple enough to stick. His mother died, there was a grave. It was over. Except it was not over, because grief does not follow the instructions given by the official story of a loss. Grief follows its own structure, which is the structure of what was actually lost, rather than the structure of what the loss was explained to be. Homer grieved not just his mother's death but the specific relationship she would have been and was not allowed to be, the specific version of himself that she would have produced and that the loss prevented. When he finds her in season 7 and then loses her again in the same episode, the grief is doubled. He is grieving the original loss and also the brief reunion and also the future he glimpsed for about 48 hours before Burns's call to the FBI took it away again. And then he sees her again in a later season when she is dying, and there are no more reunions after that. Just the ending of the possibility of reunion, which is its own kind of loss, different from the losses that preceded it, but not less. The show handles this with a quietness that is unlike its usual register. It does not reach for a joke at the moment of Mona's death. It does not deploy a cutaway gag or a comedic side plot to provide relief from the emotional weight. It sits in the room with Homer and his mother and lets the moment be what it is. This is the show being honest about what it knows about grief, which is that it does not always arrive in clean stages or resolve into lessons or conclude with healing. Sometimes it just is. Sometimes you sit beside someone and hold their hand while they go and there is nothing to be done and no joke that helps and nothing the next episode can say about it. Lisa's grief is different but equally sustained. Lisa grieves constantly, in the specific way that a person grieves when they can see the distance between what is and what should be. She grieves for the environment. She grieves for animals. She grieves for her own loneliness. She grieves for the version of Springfield that its people seem incapable of building even though she can see it clearly from where she stands. Lisa's grief is the grief of vision without power, of seeing clearly and having no mechanism to translate what you see into change, of being 8 years old and already understanding that the world around you is failing to be what it should be and that your understanding of this is not enough to fix it and may in fact make it worse by making you so acutely aware of the gap that you cannot rest inside the ordinary comforts that allow everyone else to function. Marge's grief is the most private, the hardest to access from the outside, and possibly the deepest. Marge is the person who holds the family together. She is the structural support. She is the patience and the persistence and the specific quality of love that says, I will still be here tomorrow, regardless of what happened today. This is not nothing. This is the most necessary thing the family has. Without Marge, the family dissolves. With Marge, the family survives. But what does Marge grieve for? The show does not ask this question directly very often, because Marge's interior life is consistently subordinated to the requirements of her function within the family. She is the one who holds, the one who endures, the one who is there. What she feels about the life she is living, what she might have wanted that what she did not get, what she has learned to not want because wanting it would be too painful given its unavailability, these questions hover at the edges of the show without ever fully landing. In the episodes where Marge is given her own storyline, the ones that briefly place her at the center of the narrative rather than the periphery, a specific anxiety emerges. The anxiety of having given a great deal of herself to a particular life and being uncertain whether the life has been adequate to what she gave. Not in terms of love, because the love is real and the show does not question it, but in terms of fulfillment, of becoming, of the specific version of Marge Bouvier that existed before she became Marge Simpson, and whether that person got what she needed. The show never answers this. It can't. Answering it would require a clarity about Marge's inner life that would be incompatible with her function within the family structure. She holds. She endures. She is there. And what she feels while doing all of that remains, like so much else in Springfield, accessible only through the evidence of what is not being said. Bart's grief is perhaps the most surprising, because Bart spends the most energy of any family member performing the appearance of having no grief at all. He is the rebel, the troublemaker, the kid for whom nothing is serious and everything is material for the next prank. The show maintains this performance with considerable skill, but underneath it, Bart is a 10-year-old boy who knows he is not what his family needs him to be. He knows Lisa is the one who makes his parents proud in the ways that matter. He knows Homer's love for him is real, but also filtered through a fog of inability to understand him. He knows Marge's love is unconditional, but also carrying a persistent worry about who he is going to become. Bart's pranks are not just mischief. They are the specific behavior of someone testing the boundaries of love. Someone who needs to know whether it holds when he makes it hard. Whether the family will still be there after he has done the worst thing he can think to do. Whether being loved by these people is really as unconditional as it is advertised to be. And the answer, consistently, is yes. It holds. The love is there after the worst prank. Homer strangles him and then the episode ends and they are both fine and the relationship is intact. The strangling is not abuse in the show's framing. It is the specific physical expression of a man who cannot adequately communicate his feelings through language and whose son already knows this about him and has factored it into their dynamic. Bart's grief is the grief of knowing that you are loved and not knowing how to accept it in the form it arrives in. And Maggie's grief, if Maggie has grief, is the grief of being seen as something she is not and choosing to maintain that misperception rather than correct it. The grief of silence chosen not from absence of feeling but from the calculation that speaking would cost more than it was worth. These are the griefs of Springfield, not the dramatic losses, though those are present too. The everyday structural grief of people living inside lives that were shaped by forces they cannot see, loving each other with the tools the system left them after it took what it needed, finding warmth in the spaces the contamination did not reach. This is what the show is actually about, underneath the theories and the mysteries and the dark industrial satire. It is about these people, damaged and incomplete and loving each other anyway. And that is worth 36 years of Sunday nights. That is worth 4 hours on a night when you needed somewhere quiet to be. That is worth every second of the time you have spent in Springfield. We have been in Springfield for a long time now. You came here to fall asleep. Maybe you have already. Maybe you are drifting, somewhere in the space between listening and dreaming, and the words are becoming part of the background noise of the night, rather than something you are actively following. That is okay. That is, in fact, exactly what Springfield is for. A place you can be half present in. A place that does not demand your full attention because it has been there long enough that you know it by heart. You do not need to watch carefully to be in Springfield. You can close your eyes and the town is still there. The cooling towers on the horizon, the Quickie Mart with its perpetual fluorescent light, the school with its peeling paint and its underfunded programs, the power plant with its cracked towers and its glowing CEO, and its safety inspector who is probably asleep at his desk right now. Evergreen Terrace, the house, the couch, the family. Homer is there right now, in whatever version of there Homer exists in. If he is in a hospital bed in Springfield General, he is dreaming of being home. If he is on the couch, he is exactly where he has always been. Either way, he is there. Either way, the family is intact. Bart is upstairs, planning something, not asleep, eyes wide in the dark, running some scheme through his 10-year-old mind that will either be funny or catastrophic or both, which is really the only way anything interesting happens. Lisa is in her room with her saxophone. Maybe she is playing something. Maybe she is just holding it, thinking about the things she thinks about at 8 years old when the house is quiet and the world is not asking anything of her for a few hours. The saxophone is the one place where what she feels and what the world receives are not in conflict, where her intelligence and her emotion become the same thing rather than pulling in different directions. Marge is wherever she is when she is not needed, which is to say, she is everywhere and nowhere, present in the structure of the house, in the fact that it holds together, in the fact that the family is still here, and still intact and still capable of coming home to each other. And Maggie is quiet, watching, waiting. The pacifier moves in a slow rhythm. The enormous eyes take in the room. The thoughts behind them, whatever they are, will remain her own for another episode, and another episode after that, and another after that. Springfield does not end. It just gets quieter. The cooling towers creak in whatever weather Springfield is having tonight. The three-eyed fish circles in its river. Hans Moleman is somewhere, presumably fine, probably not, but fine by next week regardless. Ned Flanders is in his house, praying to a God who talks to his neighbor and has not yet said anything directly to him, maintaining his faith anyway, because the structure of the faith is the structure of his survival, and you do not abandon load-bearing walls. Burns is at his appointment, glowing in the waiting room, waiting for the treatment that will give him 7 more days. 7 more days to remember the Spanish-American War and move chess pieces and make decisions that ripple through an entire town without anyone in the town understanding where the current is coming from. Springfield is asleep, or it is dreaming, or it is both, which is the same thing, which has always been the same thing. And wherever you are right now, whatever bed or couch or floor or wherever the night has put you, you are a little bit in Springfield too. You have been for as long as you have been watching, for as long as the show has been on, for as long as Homer has been stumbling through his life with the specific quality of good-hearted incompetence that makes you root for him despite yourself, or because of yourself, because there is something in his particular brand of failing upward that feels familiar in a way you have never quite been able to articulate. He is us, she is us, they are all us. The family on Evergreen Terrace, frozen at the ages they were when we first found them, is the family we built in our heads for all the years we have been watching. They are ours in a way that fictional characters rarely become ours, because we have spent enough time with them that we have started to confuse loving them with knowing them, and the confusion feels like home. So here is the final theory, the one that contains all the others. The Simpsons is not a show about Springfield. The Simpsons is a show about the people watching it, about what we need from a story when the real world is asking too much of us, about why we keep returning to the same house on the same street week after week, year after year, decade after decade, even as the real houses we grew up in change hands and the real streets we walked on become unrecognizable. We return because the return is the thing, because coming back to something that was there before is the definition of home. And The Simpsons is one of the only things left that most people in this culture have in common, that was there when they were young and is still there now, unchanged, permanently and impossibly unchanged. Bart is still 10. The cooling towers are still cracking. The water is still wrong. And we are still here. And the night is quiet. And Springfield is somewhere, always somewhere, at the end of the channel. Sleep well. The family will be there when you wake up. They always are. That is the whole point. That has always been the whole point. Before we get deeper into the structural darkness of Springfield tonight, let's stay with something quieter for a moment. Something that the show builds on and returns to more consistently than any of its theories or mysteries. Something that predates the contamination argument and outlasts the coma speculation and persists through every season regardless of quality. Homer and Marge are in love with each other. This is not a small statement. In a show that runs for 36 years and involves the same two people in a marriage across that entire span, maintaining the genuine emotional credibility of that love is an achievement that most long-running shows do not manage. Married couples in sitcoms tend to calcify into comedy dynamics. The nagging wife, the hapless husband, the marriage as the setup rather than the relationship, the love as assumed background noise rather than something the show actually believes in and returns to and treats as worth protecting. The Simpsons does something different. It makes Homer and Marge's marriage the emotional load-bearing structure of the entire show, and it treats it, consistently across decades of episodes, as something real and complicated and worth having. Not perfect, not easy, not free of the specific strains that come from two people trying to coexist inside a life that is often difficult and sometimes absurd and never quite what they imagined it would be. But real? Homer loves Marge with the entirety of what he is capable of, which is, admittedly limited by everything that Springfield and his history and his biology have done to him, but which is still considerable. He loves her in the specific way of a person who cannot fully express what they feel and who has therefore learned to express it through presence. He comes home. Every episode, he comes home. No matter what happened, no matter how badly the day went, no matter how many things exploded or collapsed or went wrong, Homer comes home to Marge. And Marge stays. Every episode she stays. Not because she has no other options, though the show occasionally explores what those options might look like, and not because she is defined entirely by her role as wife and mother, though the show has struggled at times with giving her sufficient interiority beyond those roles. She stays because the marriage is real to her, because Homer is real to her, because whatever Homer Simpson is, broken and incomplete and damaged in ways she may not fully understand, he is also the person who loves her more completely than anyone else in her life has ever managed to love her, and she knows it, and that knowledge is the foundation of the life she has chosen. There is an episode in which Homer, temporarily intelligent after the crayon removal, writes a scientific paper that gets published. The paper is well received by the academic community. He is, briefly, a person whose intellectual accomplishments are recognized and respected. And Marge tells him, in the episode, that she finds the smart version of Homer frightening, not threatening. Frightening. There is something about the smart Homer that does not fit the space she has learned to inhabit around him. This moment is played as comedy. The joke is that Marge prefers her dumb husband to the possibility of a smarter one. But the reality underneath the joke is more complicated. What Marge is expressing is not preference for stupidity. She is expressing something about the specific intimacy they have built across the life they have shared, in which his particular configuration of strengths and limitations has become the shape of the relationship, and a different configuration, even a theoretically better one, would be a different relationship, one she would have to learn all over again, one that might not hold what their actual relationship holds. This is one of the most honest things the show has ever said about long marriages. That love adapts to the specific person it is given to, and that the adaptation itself becomes irreplaceable, not just the person. There are also the episodes in which Marge is given reasons to question the marriage, the brief connections she develops with other men, the moments when someone sees her clearly in a way Homer consistently fails to do, and the warmth of that recognition is palpable. The show handles these moments with surprising care, allowing the pull to be real, allowing Marge's response to be complex, and consistently choosing to have her return to Homer, not because she cannot imagine anything else, but because Homer is what she has chosen, and choosing him again is an act that means something. The marriage survives not because it is easy, but because both of them keep choosing it. This is, in the context of everything else we have discussed tonight, the most quietly radical thing the show does. It places a genuine loving marriage at the center of a story about a contaminated town run by a corrupt billionaire in which nothing works properly, and time has stopped, and the fish have 3 eyes. And it argues, through the mere fact of the marriage's persistence and emotional credibility, that love is not dependent on perfect conditions. Love is what you find in the space that remains after everything else has been taken. Homer was left with very little. The radiation took some of what he might have been. The crayon took more. His mother's absence took the emotional foundation that would have produced a more secure and more capable adult. Burns took the conditions under which he might have thrived. Springfield took the cognitive capacity he would have needed to understand any of this clearly. What was left after all of that is the person Marge fell in love with, the specific Homer who exists at the intersection of all that loss, who is funny and warm and catastrophically incompetent, and loves his family with a completeness that his vocabulary is not big enough to express. And Marge loves that Homer, the actual one, not the one he might have been. That is the theory the show has been advancing for 36 years, hidden in plain sight beneath the nuclear power plant and the glowing billionaire and the baby with the gun and the town that cannot be located. Love is possible in Springfield, even in Springfield. Maybe especially in Springfield, because if love can survive there, it can survive anywhere. One element of the show that rarely gets the attention it deserves in any serious examination of what The Simpsons actually is and how it actually works is its music. The theme, composed by Danny Elfman and first heard in December of 1989, The Simpsons theme is one of the most recognizable pieces of music in the history of American television. Not recognizable in the vague, ambient sense of a theme you have absorbed without noticing. Recognizable in the specific sense that the first 4 notes of it produce an immediate and visceral response in anyone who has watched the show at any point in their life. A response that is physical before it is cognitive. Something that happens in the body before the mind has time to process what it is responding to. This is what music does when it is sufficiently embedded in experience. It bypasses the thinking part of the brain and goes directly to the part that maintains emotional memory. The Simpsons theme is not just associated with the show. It is associated with every specific memory of watching the show. With the couch you were sitting on the first time you heard it. With who else was in the room. With the age you were and the feelings you had and the particular quality of Sunday evening in whatever year it was. The theme plays and 36 years collapse into a single moment. You are not watching The Simpsons. You are remembering watching The Simpsons, and the memory is indistinguishable from the experience, and both of them feel like coming home. This is the function of music in the show more broadly. The show has always used music to do things that the writing cannot do directly, to access emotion that the comedy format would otherwise deflect. to slow down the rhythm of a scene at precisely the moment when slowing down would be most effective, to tell you that something matters even when the joke is about to land and will require you to laugh at what matters. The most striking example of this is Lisa's saxophone. Lisa plays the alto saxophone. She plays it throughout the series with a skill and a feeling that the show presents as genuine. And the music she produces on it, the specific notes and phrases that the show writes for her instrument, are consistently doing something that the dialogue around them cannot quite do alone. When Lisa is sad, she plays something that sounds like sadness processed into something beautiful. When she is hopeful, the saxophone sounds like hope. When she is lonely, the specific quality of a single instrument playing in a large room, the sound that the saxophone makes in those moments, is the loneliness made audible in a way that the words she might say about it could never achieve. The saxophone is Lisa's interior life made public. It is the place where she says what she cannot say in words, where she expresses what the family's noise does not permit to be expressed in ordinary conversation. And every time the show lets Lisa play, uninterrupted, for long enough that the music becomes the scene rather than the background of the scene, something happens to the viewer that the comedy does not produce. A kind of recognition, an opening. The show uses this deliberately. It knows what the saxophone does. It has known since the earliest seasons, and it deploys it at the moments when it wants to say something true that the joke cannot contain. Alf Clausen composed the music for the show across its most celebrated periods, and his work is a significant part of what gives the show its specific emotional texture. The way the score moves between comedic underscore and genuine emotional support within a single scene, the way it honors the feeling of a moment without telegraphing it too broadly, the way it makes room for the joke and also for what is underneath the joke. This is not incidental to what the show is. It is constitutive of it. A different score would produce a different show. One that was funnier or one that was sadder, but not one that held both at the same moment with the same apparent effortlessness. The music of Springfield is the show's permission structure. It gives the audience permission to feel something while laughing and to laugh at something while feeling it, and to not have to choose between those two responses because the music is holding both of them simultaneously. This is what the best comedy does. Not choose between funny and true, but refuse to separate them, insisting that the funniest things are usually true and that the truest things are often, underneath the grief of them, also funny in the specific way that absurdity is always a little funny, even when it is also devastating. Springfield is absurd. Springfield is devastating. Springfield is funny. The music knows this. The music has always known this. In the early seasons of the show, before the coma episode and the post-coma drift into increasingly surreal territory, Bart Simpson was the audience surrogate. He was the character who was supposed to represent the viewer's relationship to the world of Springfield. He was irreverent and funny and unimpressed by authority and occasionally kind in ways he pretended not to be. And the combination was compelling enough that he became, briefly, the most famous 10-year-old in America. T-shirts, catchphrases, the specific cultural saturation of a character who landed at exactly the right moment with exactly the right qualities to become emblematic of something. And then the show outgrew him as a surrogate. As the audience aged and the cultural conversation moved, Bart's specific appeal began to require more context than it used to. The rebellion that felt fresh in 1990 needed more scaffolding in 2005. The catchphrases became artifacts. The cultural saturation that had made him ubiquitous became the thing that made him feel dated. But what the show did not lose, across all of that, was the specificity of who Bart actually is underneath the cultural phenomenon. Bart Simpson is a kid who needs to be seen. This is the engine of almost every significant Bart storyline that works. The pranks are not about destruction. The pranks are about attention. Each one is a question, asked with maximum volume and minimum subtlety. Am I visible to you? Do you know I'm here? Are you going to respond to what I do? The world mostly responds by punishing him. Principal Skinner responds. Teachers respond. Homer responds. With the strangling, which is a response that is definitively not what Bart is looking for but is at least a response, is at least confirmation that Bart's actions have reached someone and produced a reaction. The episodes where Bart is at his best are the episodes where the show finds him someone who sees him clearly. Not the pranks, not the misbehavior, but the actual person underneath the performance. The teacher who recognizes something in him that none of his other teachers have acknowledged. the elderly man in the retirement home who becomes his friend, the girl who sees through the troublemaking to whatever is generating the troublemaking. These relationships work because Bart responds to genuine attention the way a person who has not had enough of it responds, with a vulnerability that is all the more powerful for being so rarely visible. He becomes, briefly, the kid he might have been if the world had been more consistently interested in who he actually was, rather than what he was doing. And then the relationship ends, as these things do, and Bart goes back to being Bart, and the pranks resume, and the world goes back to responding the way it has always responded. The tragedy of Bart is not his misbehavior. It is the reason for it, which the show understands and presents with considerable compassion even while it plays the misbehavior for laughs. Bart is 10 years old and he has already learned that performing is safer than being real, that the prank produces a more reliable response than the honest statement of need, that the world knows what to do with Bart the troublemaker and does not know what to do with Bart the kid who needs something he does not know how to ask for. This is not unique to Springfield. This is not a product of the radiation or the coma or the collective denial. This is simply what happens to some children in some families in some communities, and the specificity of how the show renders it, the way it lets Bart's vulnerability surface, and then protects it under a layer of comedy before the scene can get too real, is one of the reasons the character has lasted. Bart Simpson is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old for 36 years. And in all that time, across all those episodes, he is still asking the same question with every prank and every detention avoided and every authority figure successfully provoked. Are you paying attention? Is anybody actually paying attention? The Simpsons has spent 36 years engaged with religious faith in a way that is more sophisticated than almost anything else American television has produced on the subject. It is not respectful of faith in the sense of being deferential to it, but it is respectful in the more important sense of taking it seriously, of depicting believers as real people whose beliefs are genuinely motivating rather than comic costume. The primary vehicle for this is Ned Flanders, who we have already discussed at length. But the show's religious landscape extends well beyond Ned. Homer's relationship with God is one of the show's most under-examined elements. Homer believes in God with a sincerity that is not undermined by his inconsistency in practicing that belief. He does not attend church reliably. He does not structure his life around religious principle in the way Ned does. But when Homer addresses God directly, there is something in the exchange that the show treats as genuinely two-sided. God responds to Homer. God converses with Homer. God tells Homer things. This is either the show's most absurdist comedy choice or its most theologically interesting one, and it is both simultaneously. The idea that God is more accessible to a man who sleeps through sermons than to a man who has devoted his life to seeking that access is a theological provocation that the show deploys, with complete awareness of what it is doing. It is not saying God loves Homer more than Ned. It is saying something more uncomfortable. It is saying that the specific quality of Homer's faith, unstructured and inconsistent and completely devoid of pretension, may be more authentic than Ned's elaborately constructed devotional life. That you can spend a century building a cathedral and still be less close to what you are seeking than the man who crawled into the cathedral's parking lot by accident and fell asleep before the service began. Or it is saying something even more uncomfortable, that God's attention and God's accessibility are not distributed according to desert. That the relationship between virtue and divine responsiveness is not the transactional one that Ned's faith implicitly assumes. That being good and being heard are not as connected as the devout would like them to be. This is not an argument the show makes explicitly. It makes it through the accumulated pattern of who God talks to and who God does not talk to across 36 years of Sunday nights. The pattern speaks more loudly than any individual episode. And what the pattern says is this: Springfield is a place where the normal rules of cosmic justice are suspended, in the same way that the normal rules of biology and geography are suspended, where the good are punished, and the lucky survive, and the powerful endure, and the moral calculus produces outcomes that would be deeply troubling if applied to any real ethical framework. Which is, again, America. Not all of America, not always America, but a version of America that is recognizable, the version in which the people who deserve better consistently do not get it, and the people who deserve worse consistently escape the consequences, and everyone watches this happen and goes to church on Sunday, and tries to maintain the belief that there is a plan. Ned maintains that belief. That is his heroism. not his goodness, which has been complicated by the revelation of its origins, but his capacity to maintain faith in a universe that has given him, functionally, no evidence that faith is warranted. Homer's faith is effortless because Homer's cognition is limited enough that he does not process the dissonance. The evidence for and against divine benevolence are equally inaccessible to him, so his belief floats on something that is not exactly evidence-based reasoning. Ned's faith is heroic because he processes the dissonance fully and chooses to believe anyway. He sees that Maud is dead and the house was rebuilt badly, and God has never spoken to him directly, and Homer gets more divine attention on his worst day than Ned has received across a lifetime of sincere devotion. He sees all of this, and he goes to church on Sunday. That is either the most admirable or the most heartbreaking thing in Springfield. Possibly both. Probably both. Homer Simpson has held an extraordinary number of jobs across the run of the series. In addition to his regular position in Sector 7G at the nuclear power plant, Homer has been a food critic, a boxer, a bodyguard, a restaurant owner, a farmer, a missionary, a country music manager, a carny, a security guard, an astronaut, a snowplow operator, a mayor, a small business owner of multiple varieties, a mascot, a member of a bowling team sponsored by an energy drink company, a travel agent, a pet salon operator, a voice actor, a motivational speaker, a truck driver, a police officer, a fireman, a nuclear technician of a different kind, a sugar baron, and many dozens of other occupations that the show deploys across its episodes as the premise of the week demands. This is, from the perspective of the coma theory, one of the clearest pieces of evidence available. Before April of 1993, Homer had one job. He worked at the power plant. He had always worked at the power plant. The plant was his occupation and his context, and the source of most of his professional misery. He was not a man who had many careers. He was a man who had one job, which he was bad at, in one place, which was actively harming him. After the coma episode, Homer's career history explodes into the extraordinary catalog described above. He becomes, in the years that follow, a person who has tried virtually every occupation that American culture makes available to its working class, and several that it reserves for its middle class, and a few that belong exclusively to its elite. He has done things that no individual person could plausibly have time for within a single lifetime. The coma theory explanation is simple and quietly devastating. Homer's dreaming brain, using whatever ambient noise filters through from the hospital room as raw material, generates careers for him that he never actually had. The television in his room is showing him various worlds and occupations, and the dream incorporates them, giving Homer a fantasy professional life of extraordinary breadth, in which he tries everything and succeeds temporarily at most of it before the episode ends and the next dream begins. The accumulated catalog of Homer's occupational history is the accumulated catalog of what a limited but warm-hearted man dreamed he could be if the world were more elastic than it actually is. He wanted to be a food critic because food brings him joy in a world that offers few other consistent pleasures. He wanted to be a farmer because there is something in the agrarian image, the self-sufficiency, the direct relationship between labor and nourishment, that represents a wholeness his actual life does not provide. He wanted to be an astronaut because going to space is the most completely impossible thing imaginable, and the dreaming brain does not need to respect possibility. Each career is a version of Homer. Not the real Homer, the one with the crayon and the radiation damage, and the missing mother, and the Sector 7G ID badge. A dream Homer, who gets to try things, who gets to be something different for a while before the episode ends and the next one begins. The floating career history of Homer Simpson is the most hopeful thing in Springfield. It is a man who cannot move dreaming of motion. A man who is locked into one life dreaming of all the others that exist beside it. A man who chose stupidity because clarity was unbearable, but who in his sleep chooses everything. Everything he could not choose while awake. And in the morning, or in the next episode, he is back in Sector 7G, where he has always been, where the dream always returns him. Because that is where he is. 36 years is a very long time. Most of the people who watched the first episode of The Simpsons when it aired in December of 1989 were, if we are being honest about the demographics, not quite adults yet. They were teenagers maybe, or young adults in their 20s, or children young enough that the show felt pleasingly transgressive and their parents were not entirely sure it was appropriate. Those people are now in their 50s and 60s. They have had careers and relationships and children of their own who grew up watching the same show. Some of those children now have children who are watching it. The Simpsons has been present, somewhere in the background, for 3 generations of American families. That is an extraordinary thing. It is so extraordinary that it is difficult to fully process from inside it. You cannot see the shape of something you are standing in the middle of. But step back far enough, and what you see is a family that has been in 36 years of American living rooms, unchanged, while everything around them changed. While the Soviet Union collapsed, and the internet emerged, and smartphones became essential, and streaming replaced broadcast, and the political landscape rearranged itself multiple times, and the economy rewrote itself, and the culture shifted, in ways that would have been unimaginable to the person watching the first episode in December of 1989. Through all of it, Homer came home. Bart was in trouble. Lisa was playing saxophone. Marge was holding everything together. Maggie was watching. The world changed around them and they stayed the same. And there is something in that, something in the specific reliability of their sameness, that has been worth more to the people watching than the show itself has ever fully articulated. Because you cannot articulate what it means to have somewhere that stays the same. You can only feel it. In the moment when the theme plays and the family assembles on the couch, in the particular quality of comfort that makes you exhale a breath you did not know you were holding. The theories are real. The mysteries are real. The darkness we have explored tonight is real. And so is the comfort. Both things are true. They have always been true. That is the most Springfield thing about The Simpsons. It shows you the contamination, and it gives you the family. It shows you the cracked cooling towers, and it gives you the warm house underneath them. It shows you the fraud and the corruption and the collective denial and the damaged brains and the three-eyed fish and the missing mother and the coma and the shooting and all of it, everything. Across 36 years of accumulated darkness, and underneath all of it, persistent and unchanged, the family on the couch, watching the same television, sitting in the same seats, home, and now we are at the end of 4 hours. The sky outside is either darker than when we started or beginning to lighten toward morning, depending on what time it was when you found this. Either way, you have been in Springfield for a long time. You have been in the good kind of nowhere, the comfortable dark, the specific quality of night that belongs to the hours when the world is mostly asleep. Sleep is what this was for. This was always what it was for. So close, whatever needs closing. Let whatever has been holding your attention release. The theories will still be there. The mysteries will still be unresolved. The cooling towers will still be cracking. Burns will still be alive. Maggie will still be watching. Homer will still be dreaming, if he is dreaming, or stumbling through his life, if he is awake, which amounts to roughly the same thing in the end. Springfield will still be there. It is always there. It does not go anywhere. That is the whole point. That has always been the whole point. Sleep well, and if you dream tonight, dream something warm. Something with a couch in it. Something that feels like home. You have earned it. Final bridge. The questions Springfield cannot ask. There is a list of questions that Springfield has never asked. Not because no one in Springfield is capable of asking them, though the radiation theory would suggest the town's capacity for this kind of inquiry has been systematically degraded. And not because the questions are hidden or obscure. The questions are obvious. They are the questions that a person would ask on their very first day in a new town, before the normalization set in, before the ambient reality of Springfield became the water they swam in. Why is the water that particular color on certain days of the month? Why do so many people in town share the same unusual physical characteristics? The yellow skin, the specific eye shape, the 4 fingers, when those characteristics do not appear in people who come from other places? How old exactly is the man who owns the primary employer? And how is he still functioning at that age? And what exactly is the weekly medical appointment that causes him to glow for hours afterward? Who are the skeletons in the basement of the nuclear facility? Why does the chief of police seem more interested in protecting the wealthiest resident of the town than in investigating any of the harms being done to the rest of the population? How does the principal of the elementary school not appear in military records under his name? Why does the man who dies in public with some regularity keep appearing unharmed in subsequent episodes? These are not difficult questions. A child with a functioning curiosity about the world could ask them. A journalist visiting Springfield for the first time would ask them within a day of arrival. A federal investigator with authority and resources would have the answers to most of them within a week. But Springfield does not ask them. Springfield has learned not to ask them. The learning has been so thorough and so long-standing that the town does not experience the absence of the questions as a suppression. It experiences it as simply how things are. Some things you ask about and some things you do not. And the things you do not ask about are not marked as forbidden because the marking would itself be a kind of asking. The things you do not ask about are simply not mentioned. They are not there. They do not exist in the conversation that Springfield has with itself about itself, and because they do not exist in the conversation, they do not exist. This is the most sophisticated piece of social engineering in Springfield's history. Burns did not need to tell anyone not to ask questions. He did not need to issue prohibitions or threaten people into silence. He needed only to create the conditions under which the questions would not arise, and the conditions have been operating for long enough that they are self-maintaining. The contamination creates cognitive fog. The cognitive fog prevents the questions. The prevention of the questions allows the contamination to continue. The continuation of the contamination deepens the cognitive fog. The circle closes, the loop holds, and Springfield dreams on. The questions are still there, unanswered, in the water and the fish and the cracked towers and the yellow faces. They are there in every episode that resets without explanation. They are there in every catastrophe that is forgotten by the following week. They are there in every beautiful, damaged member of a family that was broken by the system before they were old enough to understand what a system was. The questions are there. Springfield just cannot hear them. But you can. You have been hearing them for 4 hours. You have been in Springfield long enough to see it clearly, from the outside, the way that only people who are not inside it can see it. And now the night is done, or nearly done, and the questions can rest for a while. Sleep now. The questions will still be there when you wake up, and so will Springfield. Cracked towers and three-eyed fish, and a family on a couch and a man in a hospital bed dreaming of home. All of it. Exactly as you left it. Every episode of The Simpsons ends with a piece of music. Not the theme, which bookends the episode, but the specific underscore that plays over the final scene before the credits. The music that tells you the episode is wrapping up, that the story being told in this particular 22 minutes is finding its resting place for the week. This music changes constantly. It is composed to fit the specific emotional register of whatever the final scene requires. Sometimes it is warm and domestic and settling, the sound of everything returning to its proper place. Sometimes it is gently melancholic, the sound of something being understood too late or too partially to change anything but just clearly enough to feel its weight. Sometimes it is playful, the sound of a family that has survived another week and finds this, on balance, genuinely funny. What it almost never is, triumphant. The Simpsons does not end its episodes with triumph. It ends them with a kind of accommodation, with the specific quality of acceptance that comes from being the kind of people who know, on some level, that the problems are not solved, that the issues that generated the plot will not have been permanently resolved, that tomorrow will have new versions of today's difficulties, and that this is simply the shape of the life. The music honors this without naming it. It carries the feeling of an episode's conclusion, the specific emotional landing that the story has been aiming toward, and it does so with a restraint that lets the viewer complete the feeling rather than having it completed for them. This is good compositional writing for television. It is also, in the context of everything else we have discussed, the sound of Springfield being honest about itself in the one register where it is capable of honesty. In music. Because words in Springfield are complicated. Words carry the risk of saying the thing directly, of naming what should not be named, of asking what should not be asked. Words require someone to say them, and in Springfield, the social contract around what is said is so thoroughly enforced that words almost never reach the places where the truth lives. But music does not have that problem. Music cannot be accused of asking a question. Music cannot be subpoenaed or condemned by a judge's decree. Music does not violate the social contract that makes Springfield possible. Music just plays. And the truth, when it needs somewhere to be, goes into the music, into the specific quality of the notes under the final scene, into the chord that the episode lands on before the credits roll, into the 4 bars of Danny Elfman that tell you, without words, what this episode was actually about underneath what it appeared to be about. Listen to it next time, not as background, as the last thing the show says. You will hear Springfield being honest for 22 seconds before everything resets, and the next episode begins. Good night.